So hi, everybody, and welcome, and I'm glad to have you here with me today. I want to point out that I honestly, I think all of us are the same way. I would much rather be with you in person. And in fact, when we conceived, or when I was asked to do this presentation, about a year or so ago, we had made plans to fly into at Monmouth and then go up to New York City and go see a play or two with my daughter and her partner. Unfortunately, like the rest of you, we are all in quarantine or hunkering down at our places of residence. I haven't been back to my office in several weeks, and I only go in every once in a while with a mask and lots of disinfectant and gloves. Even though we have one of the lowest infection rates over at of all the 15 regional universities in Michigan. So today we're going to talk about ethics, law, and social justice. We're going to talk about beliefs and behaviors. I know who I am, and you've all heard a little bit about me. What I'd like to know is who you guys are. So if you'd all do me a favor, find your chat box, and please tell me what you do. So are you a counselor educator? Are you a student? Are you an LPC? Are you an intern? Just type something into the chat box, and our assistants will read some of the responses. And while you're doing that, I want to remind you to download and make sure you have the handouts for this session. There are a couple of case studies that we'll discuss in groups, a couple of comments in the handout, so I want to make sure you have those so when we break you up into groups, you'll know what we'll be doing. So do we have anybody throwing in a title or two in the chat box?
We have an LPC, a college counselor, another LPC, student at Rider University.
Oh, Rider, well, welcome here to Monmouth.
Children and adolescent therapist, LPC at a community college.
Okay, good.
LPC specializing in adoption and trauma in adolescents, as well as neurotherapy.
Neurotherapy, okay.
Yeah. LAC working with children who have experienced trauma.
Okay.
Counselor, educator, department chair. First year graduate student at Monmouth University. LAC. And LAC.
Okay, so LAC, so I'm assuming LAC is the licensed associate counselor, so somebody who's postgraduate but not fully licensed yet.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at what we're hoping to cover today. And let's make sure my thing here is working. There we go. Come on. There we go. So be prepared to write something in the chat box. I've got a question coming up for you real quick. That's something I'd normally ask in a large group like this, just to kind of get a feel for the group. But our learning objectives today are to list the major components of the multicultural and social justice competencies, counseling competencies, and apply them to our code of ethics. We want to take a look, and just briefly we'll do this, take a look at the legal and ethical arguments that are within the counseling competencies and apply them to case studies and standards of practice. And doing so from the point of view of the code of ethics. Talk about advocacy efforts in legislative forums, agency policies, and standards of care. What's that mean? Well, how do we advocate? How do we interact with our clients, the public, and society in general as it applies to the code of ethics? Are we required to do that? Is it something we want to do? How do we do that? All of this is going to lead us to the concept of moral injury. It's an interesting concept in medicine. And Barbara Herlihy, I sent her an article on this that we'll talk about later on in the day, in the afternoon, about the whole concept of moral injury, around the idea that when we bracket off our values, when we manage those, when we go into a session with somebody whose values or behaviors may be the antithesis of ours, that maybe we're in conflict with, but we need to work with these people to provide a non-judgmental environment. Do we have do we suffer a moral injury? And if so, how does that impact us? So we also want to create an ethical remediation plan for supervisees who are struggling with those moral concepts, the moral and value conflicts. Okay, so where would you like us to put the information we're delivering to you, as the little cartoon you see there? So I really need your help in this right now. If we were in person, I'd walk around the room with the microphone and ask people, so what are you hoping to get out of this? What are you hoping to learn from this presentation? So if you would, type a sentence or two into the chat function and let me know, okay? And I wish I had the Jeopardy music to play in the background for you, but I don't. So while you're tapping away at your keyboards, letting me know what you're hoping to learn or what you thought you were going to learn in this, I'll remind you that if we were live and in person, you'd be able to stand up and share that with the whole group. So we'll have an opportunity for that to happen when our assistants in the background are able to see some of the chats. So do we have anybody putting things up?
Yep, someone said any new changes to the code of ethics.
Okay. We'll talk a little about the history of the code of ethics and how it was developed and how change takes place. Anything else in there?
Best practices in ethical behavior in a virtual world.
Ah, okay. That is not something I was planning to cover, but I can certainly talk about that. I can think of a place where we can put that. You'll have to remind me if I'm not covering that. Please use your chat function to tell the attendant to whisper in my ear that we need to cover that. That's very important. Anything else?
Yep. Someone said supporting clients with differing beliefs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the opposite of that is also true. How do you support yourself and take care of yourself when you're working with a client whose values and beliefs and behaviors are different from your own, and in fact that you may be in conflict with?
We have how to infuse social justice work into college counseling.
Mm-hmm.
And navigating our current political climate with clients who are not social justice minded, possibly racist Trump supporters.
Well, I to be as nonpartisan as possible, and I appreciate that, we can look at that from both sides. Is how do we work with clients whose morals and belief systems are counter to our own, especially when we're looking at things through a social justice lens, or the opposite of that may be true, where somebody is so involved in social justice, so involved in advocacy that they're damaging themselves or maybe even damaging others, which is something that we as counselors try to work to avoid or to stop. Any last little pieces there, or shall we move on?
Let's see. Someone said, I hope to learn any new laws or ethics that have been enacted since we're all doing telehealth, as well as any. So similar to the above one.
Okay, so the telehealth issue, we'll talk a little bit about that. I recently completed the training for becoming a board certified telehealth provider, and I'm waiting to take the exam. And then I'll also talk about, and again, remind me there'll be a table when we talk about the history of the ethics. There's going to be a table presented that's going to show where telehealth was developed. And at that point, I'll try to remember to address those particular issues. Okay. So here's something that I want to make sure everybody understands, and it's not something that comes up very often. And this is standard F7F, the use of case examples. Back in 2000, from 2011 to 2014, for those 3 years, we worked on revising the Code of Ethics. Now, you might think, my goodness, that's a long time, and I'll give you a little history of that in a minute. But one of the things that we dealt with was the use of case examples, and it come up from feedback we'd received that, you know, I know when I talk and teach and do supervision, I talk about different case examples. And, you know, if you've ever read anything by Corey or Irving Yalom or Barbara Herlihy or Ted Remley, any of these people that write, who are prolific writers, you'll oftentimes see case studies that are thrown in as illustration. In fact, the case studies that we're going to use today are examples of that. So we also wanted to make sure that when we use case studies, any type of case examples is what the Code of Ethics calls them, that the examples for a lecture or a classroom, that you've either gotten permission of the person to use it in the presentation, or it's been sufficiently modified to obscure the identity. So I want to assure everybody that any case material that I present today has been masked. In other words, identifying information has been removed or modified, as odd as it might seem when you're presenting on a regional or national stage, at how unlikely it would be for you to know anybody that I'm seeing as a client. But we still want to ensure that their identity is protected, that their confidentiality is honored. So I'm going to give you a little history, and this is for the ethics geeks among us, and I am one of those people. And just simply ask the question, what is the purpose of a code of ethics? So again, I want you to take a moment, ask yourself that question. We don't ask it very often. What is the purpose of a code of ethics? Write your answer in the chat box. There are no wrong answers. And I'll ask the attendant to read just a couple of responses. So what is the purpose of a code of ethics? And are we seeing any responses?
Not yet.
Again, this is trying to do a virtual presentation like you would a live presentation in person, and trying to get people to answer a question.
All right, someone said protect our clients and ourselves.
Okay, so to protect our clients and ourselves. Interesting order. So to protect the client and then ourselves.
To give us something concrete to use as guidelines when we are hit with an ethical dilemma.
Okay, so it gives us that standards that we can use to help us make decisions.
Guidelines for mental health practitioners to follow, so to do no harm.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because 2 editions ago, we not only had a code of ethics, but that was the only edition where we had a standards of practice along with it. So sometimes people got confused as to which one of those you would follow, the code or the standard of practice. And let's see, do we hopefully have one more?
Yep. To create a minimum standard of behavior and provide a baseline for decision making.
Very good. Yes, excellent answer. The law, interestingly enough, provides us with what might be called a minimum standard of behavior. You have to meet these marks in that. And that's where you see in licensing boards and so forth, what they're saying is you need to do these things. This is what's expected of you. The ethics are both aspirational in the sense that these are not just the minimum things that we ask of you, but these are the things that we expect of you and what we want you to go beyond. And then they also do exactly that. They set the minimal standards of behaviors. And it's always interesting when we call them ethical guidelines and ethical standards, because within the Code of Ethics, you have ethical standards that proscribe that you have to do things or you don't do things, like don't have sex with your client. And there are other things in there that are more, these are aspirational things, like to do pro bono work, that we really want you to do this and give back to society. So Interestingly enough, our code of ethics, our current code of ethics, has a purpose set within it, and it sets it forth so that everybody understands what the guidelines are for, what our purpose is for. And so I'm just going to read these off. I hate reading slides to people, but in this particular case, there's so much up there that I want to get it out there for you. So the code sets forth the ethical obligation of ACA members and provides guidance intended to inform the ethical practice of professional counselors. I want to stop here for a moment because you'll notice that it says the ethical obligations of ACA members. While we might think that the ACA Code of Ethics applies to all professional counselors, it's important to note that it only really applies to the members of ACA and those professional counselors whose state has adopted the ACA as their own code. Now, that's an interesting little caveat because when we first were revising the Code of Ethics, we talked about having it apply to all counselors, and we had to go to the legal counsel for ACA to ask if we could do that. And we're informed that we really couldn't because we don't have the power of enforcement on somebody who is not a member of ACA. I mean, actually, what would we do? We can't throw them out of our organization. And we certainly represent the profession, but we're not the profession in the sense that somebody who's not a member can certainly call themselves a professional counselor if that's how it's defined in their law. The interesting caveat to that, or something important to note, is that while a state may not specifically refer to the ACA Code of Ethics in their law, it is the standard that is generally used in evaluating complaints. And there are well over, I think, 27 states that refer to the ACA ethical code within their law as to what they expect professional counselors to follow. So it's kind of that in that area where we can't apply it to people who aren't members, but the state will or may use it as the standards to follow, and therefore it will apply to every counselor in that state. In the states where it isn't specifically written into the law, looks like all of us. Okay, I'm back. Okay. Just want to make sure I'm back. That my screen just went kablooey.
You're great, Perry.
Okay, but I'll just go over to here. And so what happens is that the state then enforces it or uses it as an expectation. Now, the Code of Ethics is considered relevant to the professional counselors and counselors in training. Of course, as we want to make sure that everybody understands, is that when you become a counselor in training or a student in a professional counseling program, you're expected to follow the code. As other people have identified, the association, it clarifies for current and prospective members and those served by members the nature of our ethical responsibility held in common by all people. And the code serves as an ethical guideline designed to assist us in constructing what we call a course of action, what we normally call a decision-making model. You'll note that the code does not proscribe a decision-making model, and in fact, if you go into the literature, there are lots and lots of different decision-making models. The code is designed to help support the mission of the American Counseling Association, and the standards contained in the code serve as the basis for processing ethics inquiries and complaints. In fact, for the last 3 or so years, I served on the ethics board for the American Counseling Association. It's always interesting to see how we as professional counselors move through ethical decision-making when it comes down to processing complaints. We don't receive a lot of complaints, and when we do, it is a very thoughtful and time-consuming manner to make sure that we've got everything worked out. Okay, so I'm trying to move my slide forward, and when the screen changed, there it goes. Okay, so here's a brief history again. When we talk about the codes, as you all have heard, we're there to establish norms and expectations. So it's to protect the welfare of the client, beneficence. It's to minimize risk. And I need to move this thing. Communicate our orientation of service, fidelity, and then to set the standard of care. Oh, there we go. Okay, let me ask my moderators, did you take over my slides? Because I can't control them.
Yes, Barry.
Okay. So what else is it? It's communicating to the public our commitment of care. Okay, it's a way for us to transmit our values and also to acculturate the people who want to enter our profession. So basically, what does that mean? We use the code as a way to professionalize people who are seeking to enter our profession. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the other things that's really important, if you think about the history of the, not just the code, but the history of professional counseling, you'll find that it helps to meet one of the requirements that counseling is a legitimate profession. When you think about how we developed as a profession, some of the hallmarks that made us a profession, and there are those particular hallmarks. So, for example, that you have a university-based training program. In other words, this isn't something that you can just open up a box, learn some material out of that box, and then hang a shingle. That you have a specialized set of knowledge and skills. And in doing so, you establish that professional association, that there's a place where people gather to develop their identity, to refine that identity, to bring people together to hear continuing education, which then goes to disseminating scholarly research. As you know, we have numerous journals, which our flagship, of course, is the Journal of Counseling and Development. The other part of a profession, one of the hallmarks of a profession, is that it advocates for its members. One of the benefits for belonging to ACA, or like one of the benefits of the profession itself, is having ACA, because ACA advocates for professional counselors in Washington, D.C. and in state houses across the nation. I can remember several times when I served on the governing council for the American Counseling Association, having what we called a day on the Hill, where all of us went up to different legislative offices in Washington, D.C. after some training to advocate or lobby for the profession. It also helps us regulate ourselves through licensure and a code of ethics. And this is where the code of ethics fits into this, is that, and I'll show you a slide here in just a moment that helps us understand why this is important, is that with regulation, we create professionalization. We define who's a professional and who's not, what training is required and what training isn't required, and how we become competent as professionals. So please, next slide. So one of the things that developed, I graduated in 1997, and it was just beginning to really take off about that time, was a thing that was called coaching, not the athletic type of coaching, but the type of coaching that would take place in counseling offices and just regular offices. And we've got business coaching, we've got life coaching, we've got career coaching, all of these type of non-counseling, but more professionalized types of services that are more directive and quite honestly, a bit more expensive than doing counseling. So professional counseling, you can see all the different types of things that are the hallmarks of the profession. University-based training, specialized knowledge and skills, and an accrediting association that develops those. The profession, the disseminating research, and so forth. In coaching, there really is no university-based training. Several years ago, I was working on a presentation on what was coaching and began to look into the different training modules. And one of the things I discovered was, to a certain extent, it was counseling light. In other words, when you went and looked at what their training was about, they did a lot of basic relational skills, but they also had some very clear boundaries saying, you know, this isn't counseling, and you don't need all the extra training to do this. What you need are these skills. So they do have a specialized set of knowledge and skills that they disseminate through different training, I might say different training platforms. So you have companies that provide training to people. There was a time when I thought I might do this just for the knowledge of how different it was from counseling and I decided against it, because as I started looking through the outlines of the training, I realized that all this was very solution focused, very nuts and bolts focused type of knowledge that could be learned in a bachelor's degree and applied to, for example, career focus, applied to assessments and then setting up goals for people to meet. Okay, something on my screen there. Okay. They do have journals. They do advocate for their members, but they don't regulate themselves through licensure, and they do have a code of ethics. And I have a story to tell about the regulate itself through licensure. I think it was in the state of Arizona, when coaching was really beginning to take off, that their association, the International Coaching Federation, sent lobbyists to the state legislature to advocate against licensure. They feared that if they had to have licensure, that they would have to start developing very specific guidelines as to who could be a coach and who couldn't be a coach. And in so doing, they might cut out some people who didn't have mental health background or didn't have advanced degrees, who might, in their opinion, be very good coaches. And in so doing, they worried that they might lose part of their constituency. They also were very clear that what they do is not counseling. And their rationale in that particular case was that since we're not doing counseling, and all we're doing is really coaching and very solution focused at that, that it doesn't need to be regulated. Slide, please. So just real quick, for the ethics geeks among us, in 1953, Donald Super, for those of you who are in your beginning classes, you should recognize that name, was president at that time of the APGA. He appointed a special team to create the first code of ethics, and it was proposed in 1959. Now, as they began to develop it, they wanted to look at the APA code of ethics, and they sought to study that and see how it applied to what they were doing. And they also wanted to really meet the needs of the members of the American Personnel Guidance Association. Now, if you remember your history at all, that was one of the predecessor bodies to the ACA. And it reflected what was going on in counseling at that time, how it was developing into a profession. Go ahead with the slide. So some fast facts about the Code of Ethics. The first Code of Ethics is 4 pages long. It is 3,800 words approximately. And it's really interesting because when we were working to revise the Code of Ethics, one of the things that I wanted to do was take a look at the previous codes and see how we developed as a profession. I'm sure that all of you are riveted by the idea of spending your evenings going over the different codes to see how they relate to each other. Well, when you take a look at what the first code looked like, you really get a sense of where we were back in 1962 as a profession and what we were doing. And when you take a look at the 2014 code, how much more developed we are, how much more complexity and nuances in the things that we do. Now you can see there the different dates of the revision, and each revision reflects that growing professionalization. Next slide. And this is the table I was talking about. When you take a look at the headings of each section for the Code of Ethics across time with each revision, you can see how what we were doing was growing. So in the first code, you have a preamble, a general section, which is made, basically an introduction. They talk about counseling, testing, research and publication, consulting, and private practice. And then something you don't see in the current code, which is personnel administration. And then, of course, preparation for personnel work. You see that continued all the way through personnel administration, all the way through 1988. It was the 1995 code that also had the standard of practice. And you can see with all the little arrows how things developed, how they moved around, and how we split out certain pieces. So for example, in the counseling relationship, we eventually split out confidentiality and gave it its own section so we could develop the concept of confidentiality. Preparation standards came in 1981, but then they moved up to teaching, training, and supervision and have been that way since 1995. Now, just so everybody understands, and this is where I'll address part of this, is in resolving ethical issues, it moved down to the very end from 1995 on. But in this last revision, we put in a whole separate section for distance counseling, technology, and social media, where before it was, let me do something here. I want to catch up with something here on my own computer screen here. Where before it was simply in A12 of the previous edition. So where we had one paragraph in 2005, we've created a whole section in 2014. So somebody asked me to address the issues of where we find ourselves now, which is providing counseling over the internet, that a lot of us aren't seeing clients in our offices anymore because of the current pandemic. So I hadn't planned on doing this, but let me address a couple of quick issues on this. So, and these are things that we generally might not think of. And I'll give you a quick, here's a quick one, a do and a don't. Do not use Skype. Skype is not a platform that has basically HIPAA, that is set up for HIPAA standards unless you're paying for business Skype. There are platforms that have been specifically created for use in telemental health. DoxyMe, DOXY.me. DoxyMe is a platform that is specifically set up for telemental health. It has secure lines on both ends. So you would connect to the website DoxyMe, and your client would accept an invitation from you through DoxyMe. Both of you would be on a secure server through the platform, so that the visual and audio would be encrypted going to and from the counselor and client. Now, I'm not endorsing DoxyMe. There are lots of different platforms out there. In fact, Psychology Today, where a lot of people find their counselors in the therapist search box, had just recently started its own platform. In fact, I used it once to see how well it worked, and they've still got a lot of bugs to work out. But again, it's set up as a secure platform. In the Code of Ethics, for example, within distance counseling, technology, and social media, one of the big issues is ensuring that the person you're talking to is who they say they are. Now, that's an interesting idea. Why would we want to think about, gee, how can we confirm that they are who they are? Well, we do that because we're seeking to ensure that identity fraud isn't taking place, and that the people that we're seeing in counseling can give consent for the counseling that they're receiving in their name, not somebody else. So for example, one of my standard practices now, because I do counseling through Zoom and the Zoom platform that is HIPAA compliant, is that the client has to make a copy of their driver's license front and back. And if they're insurance clients, I have to have their insurance card front and back, and they have to email it to me. And then one of the things that I do is that I take a look at the driver's license and I take a look at the client to ensure that, you know, the person is who they say they are. Now, the other piece that goes with that, and this is something to think about, especially for those of us who are on university campuses, let me get a drink here, is that we're very accustomed to using our own email, university email, or we might use Gmail. The thing is, if you're in a university campus or just about any public server, is that they keep a copy of all emails on the university backbone. So what is the university backbone? That's the platform and servers that the university owns. So I learned this a while back, and I'll talk about how I learned this a little bit later, that if somebody wanted to file a Freedom of Information Act request to take a look at your emails, they can do that. Now, the university would scan those emails and want to make sure that, and would probably want a very specific request about what someone is looking for. But you don't want to email somebody who's a client and, you know, send maybe homework or a handout or something like that, and have that information then be out in the clear. In other words, be available for somebody to inspect. So you need to use a email server that is secure and encrypts email going back and forth, and that other people can't FOIA. So for example, I use Proton Mail, and I use the professional version. It costs $4 a month, and that's not a endorsement. It just happens to be what the server I use. Interestingly enough, it's based in Switzerland, and you know, known for their banks and confidentiality. And they encrypt email going both ways. So when somebody sends me an email, it's encrypted. When I send an email, it's encrypted back to the person. So you're having to think about all these different types of security features that go on to ensure the confidentiality and privacy of your client. So if you're going to use something like Zoom or something like DoxyMe, you also need to get a business associates agreement. That's part of the HIPAA Compliant Act. A business associates agreement is basically designed to acknowledge and contract with somebody to make sure that their services are up to the standards that are considered HIPAA standards and what are called the high-tech standards for use in telemental health or telemedical health. All of this is addressed in the section on distance counseling and technology and social media. Now, let me bring this back around real quick to social justice and advocacy. One of the issues you might run into is if you're trying to provide counseling to somebody who doesn't have access, public access to, say, a computer, how else would you provide services to them? And if they need services, what's the modality that you can use? Well, it's interesting. The younger my client, the more often they're actually talking with me on a secure website through their phone. Most people have cell phones nowadays, and unless you have a flip phone, which you can still get, by the way, and for those of you who are too young to know what a flip phone is, it's if you think of, you know, just opening it up like that, and rather than just that, you know, computer pad that you actually have that also happens to be a phone. Unless it's a flip phone, you know, the current phones, the smartphones, all have video functions that they can actually do counseling on. So, in thinking about all these particular ideas, when we're providing telemental health services, one of the other things that you have to keep into consideration is, are there any limitations to the type of services that you can provide through telemental health? when you go to the different training modules that people use for to train on telemental health, one of the things that they'll tell you is that the research in telemental health is that it is efficacious for all sorts of different clients. Now, the first question that I would ask, of course, is, can I use this for a client who has active suicidal ideation? Now, I live in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is right next door to Ann Arbor. I teach at Eastern Michigan University, which is 9 miles down the street from the University of Michigan. So I use that as a touch point because everybody seems to know where Ann Arbor and the University of Michigan is. We're in the southeast corner of Michigan. But I could have a client in what's called the UP, or the Upper Peninsula. So they could be up in Escanaba, which is a small town in the Upper Peninsula that sits right on a bay. It's a beautiful little town. That also happens to be 8 hours away from me. Now, if my client has suicidal ideation and I'm working with them through telemental health, I am probably not going to be able to get them hospitalized immediately without having some sort of trouble. Now, I could call the sheriff, I could call the local police and have them do a welfare check on the client and tell them who I am. But that's different than if the client were sitting in front of me and I was able to talk to them and work with them and maybe even arrange for them to go over to the hospital with a family member immediately. Well, that's a little bit harder if my client's in Escanaba. So how would I do that? One of the standards of practice, and just good practice and ethical care, is that in telemental health, one thing that you get is an emergency contact number. So you have to, you require the client to give you the name, address, and phone number of someone who you can call or they can call in case of an emergency. So it can't be somebody in 3 towns over. It needs to be somebody who's immediately close by, that if I were concerned enough to break confidentiality, I could call that person, have them go over to that the client's house and intervene, maybe take them to the hospital if the suicidal ideation requires that, to ensure their safety. I can't see a client if they can't provide me with such an identity. Now, that puts the client in a bind sometimes. They may not want anybody to know that they're in counseling. And ethically, you have to make a decision and balance the difference between having an emergency contact and if your client's at risk, being able to intervene quickly, and not having an emergency contact and having difficulty to intervene with the client. Ethically, we want to lean towards the safety of the client. And so we want to act with beneficence, what's in the best interest of the client, to ensure that their care is taken care of, or that, it's redundant, that they are cared for appropriately. So that's why you have those, the obligation of having an emergency contact name. In fact, in our own training clinic, we require as part of intake the name of a family member or another emergency contact should we have to call somebody and break confidentiality. Generally, that's never happened. I've been at Eastern for 15, going on 16 years now, and running the training clinic that entire time. And I think we've had 3 times in that 15 years where we've had to intervene and have someone removed to the hospital for advanced care. So you have all these different types of issues, or these different standards of care when trying to manage through telemental health. So what I'm going to ask right now is, if you have another question about telemental health, to pop it in the chat box, and I'll ask the moderator to let me know as we begin to move on, and I'll try and address it. So those are just some of the basics in telemental health when you're considering the ethics, and we'll try and tie that into technology. The other quick pieces about technology and social media, of course, The fun part about social media is that Facebook is ubiquitous in our world today. And in fact, we've seen how much power it has, just the social media platforms in and of themselves, Twitter and so forth, is that as a professional, you have to manage and maintain, if you have a Facebook account or any sort of social media presence, you have to manage and maintain those to make sure that they're always up to date. And I would always recommend that in your informed consent that you say something specific about social media. For example, that you don't friend your clients and don't accept people, accept friends as clients as friends on your personal social media page. And you are not permitted to stalk your clients on social media. You'd be surprised how many times I've heard counseling students say, well, can I take a look at their social media page so I can see, get kind of a feel for them? And that is actually an invasion of privacy, even if their social media page is public. If you think about it for a moment, before social media, how did we get to know our clients? We got to know them through taking a good in-depth clinical history of them during our first couple of sessions. So it's not a matter of efficiency, it's a matter of allowing the client to tell us what they want from us and what they want us to know, rather than digging into their social media and finding out things that they may not want us to know and invading their privacy. So if you could move the slide forward, please. Or perhaps I can, okay. So forth. By comparison, this is just one of those little quick things. The APA's first code was 1953, commissioned by Carl Rogers in 47. It was 170 pages long. I didn't know this till I started looking into it. 2,000 plus psychologists contributed to it. And it's interesting because due to the length, a supplementary document was created called a Summary of Ethical Principles. And the reason why it was so cotton picking long, well, it contained a list of real life conflicts. So people spent a lot of time, submitting case study after case study and conflict after conflict to ensure that the Code of Ethics was comprehensive. Next slide, please. So the current code, 24 pages long, 14,800 words if you're interested. We have a 50-word glossary in the back. The first Code of Ethics, 4 pages long, 3,800 words, no glossary. And this is the first code, as you've already found out, that had a separate section on technology, distance counseling, social media, and technology. Interestingly enough, the first Code of Ethics actually did have a small sentence about technology. It basically said that you really shouldn't be doing counseling over the phone. Next slide, please. So all codes of ethics are out of date the day after they're published. So what do I mean by that? Think about how technology has changed since 2014. In 2014, they were just developing apps that could be used for cognitive behavioral therapy. There is an app now, in fact, I have it on my phone and on my iPad called Calm, C-A-L-M. In fact, they're doing commercials on TV now. That app has grown so much, where they have 15 seconds of you listening to rain falling or a waterfall. Twitter has blown up into this huge thing because of our current political climate. The other piece you have to, if you think about the popularity of apps and tweeting and social media, just a little fun fact is that college students, current college students are leaving Facebook or not even going on Facebook as much anymore. They're using Snapchat and other apps and functions to spread their words and messages around. But apps are getting more popularity, and we barely touched the surface of that when we created the 2014 code. We also haven't made any adjustments regarding ethical implications of torture. Now that might seem kind of odd and something that just comes way out of left field, but let me give you an example of how that happened. The APA was caught in this huge dilemma when a couple of psychologists who were members of the APA, if I recall, helped with the idea of enhanced interrogation during the Gulf War. In fact, there was a movie or news show, I'm trying to remember which, just recently about that whole idea, that how that developed. And the ethical, they didn't address it, but there were the ethical implications of using psychology in a way to force people to tell you things that may or may not be true, and how that enhanced interrogation really didn't produce much and violated the code of non-maleficence. In other words, doing harm, not doing harm to someone in a way that has never been imagined. Next slide, please.
Perry, we actually have a few questions, comments in the chat.
Sure, let's go ahead and, because we're right at that point where it says, any questions about this brief history?
Oh, perfect. So someone said, is FaceTime HIPAA compliant?
No, it's not. In fact, I've been asked that question quite a lot. The problem with FaceTime is trying to get a business associates agreement with Apple. And I'm not even sure who you'd go to try and get that business associates agreement. Remember, the business associates agreement basically states that they're going to be HIPAA compliant, and they guarantee that, and they contract with you for those particular types of services. And Facebook is not set up to be confidential that way. It's more set up to be a face-to-face phone call. Next.
Yep. Someone said, performing telemental health across state lines. What if you've been working with someone remotely who is visiting family in a different state or has moved to a different state and wishes to continue working remotely together?
That's a very good question, and I want to address it in two different ways. And one with just a brief case study. I used to go over to and maybe you all don't know this, is that there is actually a European branch of the American Counseling Association, and it's been around for decades. And it was started by counselors who serve in Department of Defense bases all across Europe, who provide like substance abuse counseling and marriage and family counseling, as well as school counseling. Now that may seem like just right out of center field, but let me connect it for you. When I went over there to do some ethics presentations for them, and we were just beginning to talk about technology, I ran into several counselors over there, psychologists, counselors, social workers, who practiced counseling via either the telephone or FaceTime or some of these other platforms at the time, both across international lines in Europe. You've got to remember that Europe is a collection of countries, like the United States is a collection of states. And in fact, some of them, excuse me, we're still seeing long-term clients that they had in the United States. Now, if someone is licensed in a state, you have to take a look at what your licensure law states when it talks about practicing telemental health. State licensure laws are slowly being updated to address practicing across state lines via telemental health. And what they're telling you is that you can't do it. Basically, if your client, if you're licensed in Michigan and your client is in Ohio, it's where the client is located. So you're providing services in Ohio, even though you're located in Michigan, but you're not licensed in Ohio. You're licensed in Michigan, and Ohio would take offense. The licensing board there would take offense because they have not vetted you, they have not licensed you to practice in Ohio. So in the Code of Ethics, it states that you need to be aware of the state licensure or the licensure laws in the jurisdiction in which you and your client reside. Now, the reason why, excuse me, let me get a drink here. The reason why we say that is because at the time in 2014, there was only 1 or 2 states that even talked about telemental health, one of them being Arkansas, that actually has standards for the practice of telemental health, which is very interesting because they set the standards up way before anybody else were even thinking about telemental health. So where this really impacts a lot of people is in college counseling centers. So our CAPS, Counseling and Psychological Services Office, one of the problems that they were facing, because 90% of our university is basically all virtual right now, with the exception of laboratory classes and some fine arts classes. We can't practice face to face. Imagine you're going into your consultation room. And our consultation rooms in our clinic are about 7 by 7 feet. And you go in masked, and you have to have a plexiglass screen in between the two of you. You close the door, and one of the things we know about the coronavirus is that unless the room is appropriately ventilated, not just well ventilated, but appropriately ventilated, in other words, you're sucking the air out rather than just recirculating the air, and replacing it with fresh, that the likelihood of you getting a virus is increased by exponentially. But now you're both masked. You have this plexiglass shield between the two of you, which is impacting the volume, and it doesn't make for a good counseling session. So all the CAPS is doing right now is providing telemental health services. And in fact, across the United States, it was in the Chronicle of Higher Ed this morning, or in Inside Higher Ed this morning, or the last couple of mornings, is that a recent study showed a drop of the need for counseling services on colleges by, I think, 23%. And it's not that the need isn't there, it's that students are home taking courses online and therefore accessing mental health services in their home area, because if they're crossing state lines, CAPS can't provide services because they're licensed in the state in which the university is in. So again, back to the example of I'm in Michigan and my client's in Ohio, I cannot provide counseling services. Long answer to a short question. Any other questions?
Yep. If we work in an environment like state Medicaid where guidelines for telehealth have been relaxed, what should we be concerned about?
One, just pay attention that when are they not going to be relaxed? One of the issues that pops up is, for example, here in Michigan, Blue Cross Blue Shield eliminated copays and deductibles for the month of May and June if you were practicing telemental health. And I just was always curious as to why it was just those 2 months, because after that they reinstated the copays and deductibles for afterwards. And I think it was just basically because they saw an acute need at that time as people were getting used to the idea of the coronavirus. So paying attention to what the rules are. The other piece is if you're practicing, say, with Medicaid. Medicaid, generally, these are people who do not have the resources to be able to pay for insurance. So from a social justice and advocacy point of view, you have to try and figure out, do they have access? So it's an access issue to the appropriate technology to get counseling services. And to double back on the technology piece, the other piece that you have to consider when you're beginning telemental health services with anybody, but especially people who do not have the technology who may not have access to the technology is to ensure that they have a place that is confidential for them to do counseling. So, for example, my client may have a computer, but their only access to the internet is at Starbucks. So I can go to Starbucks, get a cup of hot coffee, or in my case, good tea, sit down in the corner of the store, access their Wi-Fi service, and do telemental health. Well, as a professional counselor, I can't do that. One, they're not in a confidential setting, and I would never do counseling in Starbucks because their coffee is too expensive. And it's just not a confidential setting. I'm trying to think if there anything else I would be aware of. Not off the top of my head. Another question? Any other question?
Oh, we have, is it okay to friend clients in a professional Facebook page? I don't mean a private Facebook page where personal information is shared. It would include inspirational quotes, short studies about mental health issues, etc.
So the quick answer is no, do not friend your clients, period, stop, don't do it. The second answer to that is you can still put up those inspirational quotes, those studies, and everything else. A group of our alumni started a counseling practice here called Ann Arbor Counseling Associates, and it has grown exponentially to include social workers, psychologists, and the owner is a former alumnus of ours who we're very proud of. They have a Facebook page to which I'm connected to, but I cannot post on their page. So you can connect, in other words, friend, but you have to have it closed. So it may sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, and I am. You have to have your settings so that they can't comment on your Facebook page. And the reason why I say that is because what if your client posts on your Facebook page something about danger to self, danger to others, child abuse, elder abuse? I mean, just go down the list of things that require us to respond. And you're not managing that page on a regular basis. You only go to it every couple of days. Well, now your client has put something up about their safety that you haven't gotten to in 4 days. While it would, it'd be hard pressed to talk about negligence, the issue becomes they informed you, you didn't monitor it, and now the client has put themselves in a difficult situation, say they've hurt themselves or they've hurt somebody else, and there might be cause for action there. And in the litigious world that we live in, I wouldn't be surprised if you couldn't find a lawyer that wouldn't try and sue you. Any other questions?
There's one more. Should counselors be concerned about clients recording our sessions?
That's a good question. Should you be concerned? That's contextual. If you think about narrative therapy, in narrative therapy, you would send a client a letter that perhaps was a review of the session. In essence, what we would call the old-time fashion recording, where you might give your impressions about what went on in the session. And the client could read the letter and use it during the week as inspiration or direction as they continue to work through whatever issues they have. In today's world, somebody might record a session, and you can do that easily on Zoom. If you're in control of Zoom, you can block that so it doesn't happen. Remember that anything, an email, a letter, a recording, a video recording, an audio recording, once you've released it to the client or that the client has control of it, you no longer control its distribution. So now that session could be put up on YouTube by your client And admittedly, it's your client's responsibility for having them, they put it up. But you have to ask yourself two questions. Is that in the best interest of the client to put that up, or is that diagnostic? And do you want your sessions put up on YouTube? You may be the best counselor in the world. You may be the next Irving Yalom as a great existential genius. But wouldn't you want to control or at least have some sort of input as to what's put up and its therapeutics, not only for the client, but for others to see? So generally, if the client's only going to use it for their own personal therapeutic reasons so that they can go back and listen to it again, and I can see the benefit of that. And at the same time, you need to acknowledge the risks that go with that. So let's, if there are no other questions, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so I'm glad to have you all back. I hope that first part was helpful to you. I know that going over the history of the code can sometimes you're scratching your head and asking, why are we doing this? It helps to provide a foundation for what we're going to do for the next 4 hours or so as we walk through social justice, advocacy, ethics, law, beliefs, and behaviors. Because now that we see the growth and how that we've grown as a profession, how our job has become more complex, how education has become much longer, how we as a profession have gone from the idea of guidance and personnel administration to clinical mental health counseling, clinical college counseling, school counseling that goes beyond just helping students figure out what course that they are going to be in. We now want to begin to take a look at and talk about the growth of social justice awareness in the code, in the code of ethics. And we need to ask the question, has it always been around in one form or another? And the answer to that question will become clear a little bit later, but the short answer is yes, it has, in various ways. So let me ask, can I go ahead? I'm going to hit request control. Let me ask the moderator if it's okay if I move my slides.
Absolutely, Barry.
Okay, so waiting for approval. I feel, oh, good, there we go. Now, I just need to click on it. There we go, they're over there. Drop my glasses. I may have to give you back control because I don't see where the little thing is that'll tell me to move. Oh, I think I found it. Okay. So we're going to put you guys in small groups. And what I'd like you to do in your small groups is to create a definition of social justice and give us an example of related to mental health. So not just social justice in the sense of this great big, huge global idea, but social justice as it relates to mental health. So I'm going to ask the moderator to throw you guys into some rooms, and it's just going to be a random thing. I think there's about 80 of you, and you're going to be in groups of about 6 or 7. And to come up, create a definition of social justice. You've got 15 minutes. If you can, take a quick minute to introduce yourself. Don't spend a lot of time on that, and talk about what social justice would look like in mental health. So back to the moderator, stick everyone in groups. Okay, so we're good. Apparently we've got everybody back. So one of the things I'd like you to do real quick, if possible, is if I hope you had somebody write down whatever definition that you came up with, is to have one person from each group, if you decided on somebody, to just type in as much of the social justice definition that you came up with into the chat box. And I think it's going to be Amanda who's probably going to read a couple of them to us. So let's see, give you a second there. I know you're typing as fast as you can. this isn't the most productive way of doing this. Like I said, if we were in a live session, you could just stand up and hand you the mic. But so type away. Give us an idea of what social justice, what you think a good definition of social justice is as related to mental health. What do we got, Amanda?
Okay, we got our first one. They said, our thoughts, seeing people within their context, fairness and equality regardless of race, religion, sex, gender, sexuality, diagnosis, etc. Advocating for the voiceless, bring those without privilege to the same playing field, meaning rights, power, and control.
Okay, very good. I like that. For 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that's pretty darn good. Let's see. Trying to capture all of those different types of things of bringing people into a good, equitable relationship. It's very interesting when we talk about equality and equitable. Equality is that everybody gets the same thing where they're at. So the greatest little comic that I saw about this, it shows three boys, each one taller than the next, trying to watch a baseball game over the fence of a field. And they each got the same size box. So the littlest boy didn't see it because his face was still in the fence. The middle boy could barely see over the fence, and the tallest kid, who could already see over the fence, was now a head taller. But they all got the same box. Whereas an equitable situation is very simple. It's the opportunity to have the tall boy not need a box so he can already see over, the smallest boy get 2 boxes so he can see over, and the middle boy who's already able to see over the top, he's doing well. So that creates that equability across all ranges. Is there another definition that has popped up?
Yep. Someone said social justice equals advocacy for equal rights for all. We have advocating for, validating, and ensuring the needs of our clients in accordance with their life experiences. Okay. Fairness and equality between all races for all clients. A blank, clean slate with no preconceived conceptions of who any one person is by looking at the client or individual person and allowing the opportunity to get to know the client for who they are and not what they look like or identify as.
Okay, very good. I like that. So if we could go to the next slide. There we go. So as it moves over there, this is from the Center of Economic and Social Justice. So one of the things that you just keep in mind to where this definition came from, that social justice encompasses economic justice, is the virtue which guides us in creating those organized human interactions we call institutions. In turn, social institutions, when justly organized, provide us with access to what is good for the person, both individually and in our association with others. Social justice also imposes on each of us a personal responsibility to work with others to design and continually perfect our institutions as tools for personal and social development. Next slide, please. And so what you're seeing there in that definition is exactly that, is that they're looking at the institutional side of it as it impacts people. From the United Nations, very simply, social justice may be broadly understood as the fair and compassionate distribution of fruits of economic growth. Again, building around the idea that helping provide people with things that'll help them grow. Next slide, please. So from the social workers, social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. That social workers aim to open doors of access and opportunity for everyone, particularly those in greatest need. Now, the next slide, because we're talking about everybody else, what about counselors? So the next slide, I will show you the slide, or the definition for Counselors for Social Justice, which is a division of ACA. That action taken by counselors to remedy social oppression and ensure that all persons have equitable access to resources and opportunities that have historically been reserved for those of privileged life status. So when you take a look at that definition along with the other definitions, you can see how we're beginning to develop as a profession, trying to take into account all the ideas of providing equitable access to not just mental health, but to all the resources necessary to help people grow and develop health in a healthy environment. So if you take a look at the next definition, or the next slide, what we're going to talk about is that all of these definitions vary in wording, but they all have the commonalities. Next slide, please. Of equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal treatment. So with these core values in mind, we can define the phrase as social justice means equal rights, opportunity, and treatment for all. So equal rights, opportunity, and treatment for all. But that's, that still doesn't seem to capture everything. Go ahead to the next slide. So social justice has been embedded in our ethics forever. In 1961 to the present, social justice has had an increasing role through a non-discrimination statement, an advocacy statement, social justice in research, as well as education. So it's got all of these particular pieces in it. Go ahead to the next slide. So I'm not going to drop you into groups. We have a limited amount of time, and we're on slide 27 of 160 slides. So we got to get moving here. So what's a social justice counselor then? So what behaviors would you expect of someone who's a counselor who's conscious of social justice issues and expectations? So think about that for a moment. I'm just asking you to conceptualize in your own head how you might practice social justice as a professional counselor or a counselor educator. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see a call for social justice from the American Counseling Association and from the Journal of Social Action and Counseling and Psychology. So what is a social justice counselor? Well, this is a person who acts within certain roles with clients holding oppressed identities, clients who hold oppressed identities, including client empowerment, change agent, consultant, facilitator of indigenous healing systems that are congruent with the client's cultural beliefs and worldviews. Social justice counselors also take on certain roles external to the counseling office to support clients from historically oppressed populations, including various forms of client advocacy and social activism. So you'll see that I've highlighted some different words here, particularly because how they impact our idea of what the ethics are. So if you think about what your role is as a counselor, it's not to do things for people, but to help empower them to do them for themselves. And in that sense, you're the consultant and facilitator, respectful of the different healing systems, the different cultural beliefs and worldview of that counselor. And you work with those populations that may be historically, or not maybe, that are historically oppressed in all sorts of different ways. And the reason why it's important to understand the idea of all different ways is because for many of us, the way we practice advocacy would be maybe within our private practice or within our university as a counselor educator, when it also calls for us to reach out beyond our roles as counselors, beyond our office as counselors, and to advocate at both the community and the political level. So that calls for social activism. So the next slide, please. So just so everybody knows, and in fact, I should probably reach over here. Let me see if I can get over there so that you all can see this. In my home office, I don't know if you all can see this, but I'm a Star Trek geek. I love Star Trek, and in fact, later tonight I will be watching Star Trek Discovery. So this is my little stuffed Enterprise. So I hope you understand the reference here is what is the prime directive for counselors? Well, given all these definitions, what is our primary obligation? So think about that. What is our primary obligation as counselors working with a client? If you would throw in a few thoughts into the chat box, what do you think our primary obligation is in working with clients? And do we have any takers to provide us with information?
We have a person who actively practices self-reflection, education, adjusts their practices, and engages in advocacy.
Yeah. Very well thought out. Thank you. See if we get one or two more.
Unconditional acceptance, client safety, do no harm.
Okay, so if you'd move to the next slide, I really appreciate those. Those are really close to my heart. So in the 1961 American Personnel Guidance Association Ethical Standards, it said the members' primary obligation, and those are the original italics. So what they really wanted to have this stand out is to respect the integrity and promote the welfare of the counselee or client with whom he is working. Now you'll note he is there, and that is just a reflection of the time. So in 1961, the meaning of this standard was limited by the culture of the time. And if you consider all that was happening in the early 1960s, you'll understand, as I think I do, or I imagine, the limitations of that statement in 1960 versus how we might take that in today's world. And as it develops over from 1961 to 2014, you'll see how it expands. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The APGA this is their statement in this, is a educational, scientific, and professional organization whose members are dedicated to the enhancement of the worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of each individual, and thus a service to society. So in 74 and 81, we're beginning to see it expand a little bit. Next slide, please. Now, this comes from the preamble in 1988, and nothing's really changed. This in this statement beyond the name of the association. Go ahead to the next slide. But now we begin to see evolving into a developmental focus, that the American Counseling Association is an educational, scientific, and professional organization whose members are dedicated to the enhancement of human development through the lifespan. And then it goes on with and if you think about what's happening, the fifth force of psychology and counseling is beginning to take shape, which is multiculturalism and social justice. That association members recognize diversity in our society and embrace a cross-cultural approach in support of the worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of each individual. So it's beginning to develop. Next slide, please. So now we have the 2005, and again, if you go down to the blue letters, it's the members recognize diversity and embrace a cross-cultural approach. So really not a whole lot of change. Next slide, please. Now, what we have here is the 2014 Code of Ethics, and several issues brought about a significant change in the preamble that talks about what our values are and how we view our purpose in the world. Two of the main issues were the court cases, Ward v. Wilbanks and Keaton versus Anderson-Wiley. And to the students in the group, I hope you're learning about those. And if you take a look at the lawsuit, just for all transparency's sake, the Ward v. Wilbanks, which is at Eastern Michigan, you'll find my name as one of the people being sued in that case. So I just want to make sure everyone's clear about that. Real quick, that case was settled out of court. Nobody really won anything in that case, and it cost, when you combine the amount that was spent by EMU and the Alliance Defending Freedom, who bankrolled Julia Ward's case, they all told spent $1.5 million litigating that case combined. If that doesn't shock you, it still shocks me. And nobody won at the end. It was settled out of court. She was paid back her tuition, and she went on to a different university and got her degree, and in fact is a school counselor in Southeast Michigan. The other thing that brought about significant change in the preamble, and by the way, the Keaton versus Anderson Wiley, that's Augusta State. Keaton lost that case. It's very similar to Ward v. Wilbanks. Keaton lost that case. She sought an injunction to not be removed from the program, and the injunction was turned down at both the state and appellate level, or at both the district and appellate level. So one of the other things that took place was, as we were revising the ethics, we took a look at other international codes of ethics. And many international codes presented a set of professional values. Next slide, please. So as we were looking at all of that, we began to say, we really need to state what our values are, what is important for us in living out our ethical commitment. And in that preamble, we clearly and plainly stated what the values of counseling are. You'll notice that number 2 and number 3, honoring diversity and embracing a multicultural approach in support of the worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of people within their social and cultural contexts, and promoting social justice. So it's no longer just embedded in the Code of Ethics, it's in the preamble, stated as a professional value of counseling. So this is the expectation that the profession has on the person entering the field. Nowhere in here does it say you have to change your personal values. It's saying that as a professional counselor, these are the expectations we have of people who enter the consultation room and world of a client. That we honor diversity, that we embrace an understanding of multiculturalism as we approach clients, acknowledging their worth, their dignity, their potential, their uniqueness, and their social and cultural contexts. Next slide, please. So as the values, as with the values, we felt it important to connect our professional values to those principles that undergird all ethics. If you know anything about the history of ethics, you can type into a PsycInfo search Beauchamps and Childress, and you'll come up with the basic principles that started, I believe, in the 60s that were identified in the medical community as those professional values. And the hint is that there are 6, what they are if we try and name them more. There are 6, there used to be 5, and there was a 6th one added, and before that there was just 4. But they start with these letters, A, N, B, J, F, V. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see what they are. So that basically what we're dealing with here is autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity. These are those foundational principles for all ethical behavior and decision-making. So if you really don't find something in the Code of Ethics that addresses your situation, you always pull back to the idea of the basic principles. Veracity is the one that was added in this particular revision, partially because we wanted to ensure that we were dealing truthfully with all the people who come into contact with counselors, professional contact with counselors. It's the idea that we don't lie to our clients. We don't lie to insurance companies. We don't lie to each other. We promise to do what we say we're going to do, and we outline what those are within our competency. Next slide, please. So, non-discrimination. All of these, by the way, go towards that idea of diversity and social justice. The introduction of non-discrimination first appeared in '81, and interestingly enough, it was lumped in with a statement using clients to meet your personal needs. So if you go to the next slide, please. So A8 in the 1981 Code of Ethics has this standard, and oddly enough, I think it really should be two standards. The first part of the standard, I think they just lumped it in there. The first part of the standard says, in the counseling relationship, the counselor is aware of the intimacy of the relationship and maintains respect for the client and avoids engaging in activities that seek to meet the counselor's personal needs at the expense of the client. Now, that is the beginning of the idea that you don't sleep with your clients, you don't have sex with your clients, you don't manipulate your clients to meet your personal needs. Now, this next statement, though, is where we begin to see the non-discrimination clause. And if you think about what's happening in 1981 and take a look at the historical events that are going on, you can see how this fits. Through awareness of the negative impact of both racial and sexual stereotyping and discrimination, the counselor guards the individual rights and personal dignity of the client in the counseling relationship. Now, the two are related to each other, but it really, it doesn't pop out as well as what we're doing now in 2014. Next slide, please. So here we come to what is the non-discrimination clause or standard in the 2014 code. The counselors do not condone or engage in discrimination against prospective and current clients, students, employees, supervisees, and so on, based on age, culture, diversity, or disability, ethnicity, race, religion, spirituality, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital or partnership status, language, preference, socioeconomic status, immigration status, or any basis prescribed by law. Now realize we were dealing with this in 2011 to 2013, and the code was then adopted in 2014. And I want to highlight two particular pieces in here. As a result of the Ward v. Wilbanks and Keaton versus Anderson Wiley case, as well as what's taking place right now. Oftentimes we are asked, if I have a client come to me and tell me what their particular issues are, and I feel that I can't provide appropriate services for that client, can I refer that client? The answer to that is a qualified yes, if the referral is based on competence. That's why it says discrimination against prospective or current clients. And later on this afternoon, I'll talk about the difference between a cultural value conflict and competence. And then the other part, if you take it, as you read into this, and the reason why I gave you the dates is when we were running through or revising these codes, is if you think about what's happened since 2014 to now, immigration status. I think Shannon would give me permission to say this. Shannon Hodges, who's a professor at Niagara University, was on the Code of Ethics revision task force with me. And Shannon made a very strong case about immigration status and how immigrants in the United States are treated differently than quote unquote naturalized or U.S. citizens, naturalized citizens, or people born here, and how that has impacted their ability to obtain mental health services, whether they're legal or illegal. And I think about that, just that definition. How can somebody be illegal They're not. Their status is. But does that cause us as professionals to deny them services? And the answer to that question is no, it doesn't. And in fact, we'll talk about a case or an article here a little later that addresses that particular issue. Next slide, please. So as you can see, from 1981 to 2014, in 81 it built in the idea of the awareness of the impact of stereotyping and that you work to guard the rights. In 2014, we say you don't engage, we don't condone or engage in discrimination. We're very upfront about it. It's more direct, it's more specific, and it gives a long list of people who have suffered discrimination. And I'm, given our current political situation, some of you have talked about or asked about how do we address the current political situation. If you're working with a client who has strongly held values and beliefs that are different than your own in the political world, is the idea that we are driven by both the multicultural and social advocacy counseling competencies and by the values of our profession to acknowledge the worth and dignity of all persons, even those who are sitting in front of you that you would normally never want to invite to Thanksgiving dinner. That person in front of you is worth the non-judgmental environment for them to voice whatever their concern is. And if they ask you what yours is to always, as I teach my counselors in training, to ask, what's the question behind the question? And then to explore with that client how that might impact our relationship. That my role here is to provide you an environment for you to work on what's going on for you. And that I want to provide an environment of that is not judgmental, that is not going to interfere with our ability for you to feel safe and comfortable to work out whatever it is that you might work out, even though it might make my blood boil. Oftentimes counselors will ask me, how do you do that? And I do it by asking myself, how is this behavior diagnostic or related to the issue at hand? So as some of you heard, or as all of you heard at the beginning of our session today, I'm a former Lutheran pastor. And so I have some strongly held religious beliefs. I spent 15 years standing in front of others on Sunday, preaching what I considered to be very important information. And I've worked with people. In fact, I worked with one person who basically told me he thought religion to be very weird. And if you think about it for a moment, how he viewed it, it made perfect sense. That we got up on Sundays, and I, as a Lutheran, wore clerics, and I had an alb, which is that white garment that you put over, and a stole, which is the sign of my office, which is that piece of cloth that goes around my neck, and down the front, and a chasuble on the days we celebrated communion, which looks like a great big pump tent that I had hold over my head, and I looked very much like the Catholic or Episcopal priest. And he said, you dress up on Sunday and you put on costumes. And everyone repeats the same thing, as if you're in a cult. And rather than take offense to that, what I looked at was, how does this impact him? What difference does that make to him and to who he is as a person, and how that impacts his relationships with others? Rather than my taking offense to that, I reframed it as how he views the world and how important it is for him to let me know that. So if we go to the next slide, please. So something you all wanted to hear about was advocacy as ethics, doing more than counseling. So I want to remind everybody before I jump into this to let everybody know that if you have questions throughout the session, to go ahead and throw them in the chat box, and they'll interrupt me and throw the question up to me. Okay, so if you have any questions during the time. Okay, so definition. What is advocacy? Well, it's the promotion. This is from the glossary. Isn't it nice that the ethics has a glossary? The promotion of well-being of individuals, groups, and the counseling profession within systems and organizations. Advocacy seeks to remove barriers and obstacles that inhibit access, growth, and development. So you'll notice that advocacy happens on at least 3 levels here: for individuals, for groups, and also for us as a profession. Next slide, please. So the core responsibilities here when we think of advocacy as an action is within the current codes, it's seen as a professional responsibility. So, for example, that counselors are expected to advocate to promote changes in individual, group, institutional, and societal levels that improve the quality of life. Well, I want to use the ACA as an example of this. And I do this because, one, I strongly believe that the ACA is a good organization that advocates for the profession, but also for everybody else. And also because without a professional association, we would have to figure out how we could come together and do these same things. And we're fortunate that we have ACA, AMCA for mental health counseling, ASCA for the school counselors, and so forth, the American College Counseling Association for the college counselors, and so forth. But we still, even though AMCA and ASCA have left the umbrella organization of ACA, we still do come together to advocate for professional counselors across the board. So I want to, when you take a look at this, I want you to take a look at the levels it's asking us to advocate on: individual, group, institutional, and societal. And this will make sense here in just a couple of minutes when we talk about how we might do advocacy as a profession. Okay, next slide, please. So within the code itself, we're promoting the growth and development of our clients by working to remove barriers to service. So when we work with clients and we find a barrier to service, one of the things we might do within our own organization, if it's our own clinic or a clinic that we work for or an agency that we work for or within government or society, would be to simply work to remove those barriers, to change at the societal level. When it says intro, by the way, the Code of Ethics, just really quick, for each section of the code, A, B, C, D, E, and so forth, you'll have a opening introduction section. Those are aspirational or seen to be aspirational as well as prescriptive. So advocating for change at the societal level to improve the quality of life for our clients, to address bias in assessment and diagnosis. And there's a very, it's E8, I believe, where we're talking specifically about being aware of the impact diagnosis might have on somebody, as well as understanding diagnosis, not just from a broad level, but how diagnosis might be used inappropriately when you take into consideration somebody's culture and how they live out their culture. Recruiting and retaining a diverse faculty and student body that is reflective of our diverse culture in our society. So it's not enough that we just run admissions workshops and counselor education programs, and this is also a CACREP standard. It is that we are supposed to actively work to try and bring in a diverse faculty and student body that is reflective of our society at large. Next slide, please. So when you take a look at the advocacy competencies within the ACA, you can see, as this graphic shows, the comprehensive nature of this concept, that we move from individual to the public arena. So if you look across the top of this box, this cube, you'll see that we work with clients and students, and this is meant for both clinical counselors and people who work in the school counseling realm, by empowering them. And then as you move across within the school or community, out into the public arena to address inequities in society. And as you go across, you'll see that working with clients in the community and society level, empowering students, collaborating with the community, providing public information. And then across the bottom, on behalf of clients, individuals and systems within the social and political realms. So as you can see the arrows on either side, we're working on behalf at the micro level, all the way across with at the macro level. So as we're working individually within the within excuse me, within say the region that they are at, and within the world in which they live in. So next slide, please. So here is a very good example of how we would live that out as counselors. This comes from an article written by Beck and Meyer and Means and Isaacson, the title of which is Interdisciplinary Collaboration for LGBTQ Students in Foster Care, Strategies for School Counselors. Now, here's a very interesting problem, and it's one that we've known about in counseling and psychology and social work for years, that youth in foster care are at increased risk. We have a program at EMU called EMU Magic, and the magic is that, and this was started at Western Michigan, at Eastern Michigan, and at a lot of universities across the United States. We have special scholarships and programs set aside for foster youth. Now, that program has been created so that kids who have aged out of foster care, so they've hit 18, they're considered adults, they're no longer in foster care, and if you don't have a good relationship with the foster parents, you know, when you hit 18 and you're done, you graduated, that you're probably going to move out and you're going to be on your own. And if you remember what life was like for you at 18, possibly with a very supportive family, now imagine what it would be like if you don't have a supportive family that, you know, in foster care, there's lots of care and love, but you're moved out. They're not getting paid to have you anymore. You've got a good high school education, but where do you go from there? Who are your mentors? Who are the people that guide you? At Eastern Michigan, we have scholarships and programs set aside for for kids that have aged out of foster care. They come to the university. It's a small group. We try and have them all work together and stay together, provide them scholarships to go to school, mentors to help them work through school, and then teaching them to mentor each other, and social supports. So for example, during the winter break or during holiday breaks, where they might not have a family to go home to, that they arrange for families in the area to have them come over for a holiday meal, to make connections or to build that holiday meal and that holiday tradition within that sub-community itself, so that the likelihood of them dropping out is decreased markedly. Because foster youth have a very low attendance and success rate at the undergraduate level. Now imagine you're an LGBTQ youth in foster care. That places you at even increased risk. So these foster placements are ill-equipped, as it says from the Human Rights Campaign, ill-equipped to competently meet their needs and subjects them to further bias and discrimination. So we're at that intersection of two marginalized groups, foster care kids and the LGBTQ plus population. But they're not alone. They have their school counselors. But the school counselors can't do it themselves. So how does a school counselor then advocate for that population? Next slide, please. Well, in the ASCA ethics, it says, advocate for the equal rights and access to free, appropriate publication for all youth, in which students are not stigmatized or isolated based on their housing status, disability, foster care, special education status, mental health, or any other exceptionality or special need. Clearly, the LGBTQ population, foster youth, fall into this category. Next slide, please. So as I was reading this article again for this presentation, I came across this quote that I thought really was very, very powerful. The school counselors can take intentional steps to help merge together the practices of child welfare and educational systems in the design and implementation of an interdisciplinary approach to supporting LGBTQ youth in foster care. That's a lot of words, and it doesn't sound, as inspirational and soaring as, say, the John Kennedy speech, "Ask not what you can do for your country." But it does capture the role of advocacy, that we are taking intentional steps to merge together different people in the child welfare and educational systems to implement an interdisciplinary approach to supporting these youth. So next slide, please. So what we have done is identify the problem. We have an ethical mandate in both the ACA codes and the ASCA codes, both aspirationally and mandated. We even got a great quote. So what's the plan? Next slide, please. Well, it's pretty simple. What's the role of the school counselor? After assessing the needs and bringing people together, bringing those together who can help through advocacy efforts. So who? We bring the pre-K through 12 educators together. We bring the school psychologists in. We bring the family or caregiver. We bring in social services. We bring in college programs, such as the MAGIC program, so that as students are as foster youth are exiting programs, as LGBTQ plus youth are exiting the program, they have a direction and a future towards higher education. So part of advocacy in this part is not going it alone, but mastering the art of bringing people together so that we can work to provide appropriate services in an equitable fashion to a deserving and underserved or discriminated against population. Next slide, please. So school counselors, I like this quote as well, that school counselors are positioned to advocate and identify barriers on behalf of the LGBTQ youth in foster care collaboratively across multiple disciplines. So how does that look like in the competencies, the ACA competencies? Next slide, please. So as you can see, we're acting on behalf of the students at the micro level, connecting with them, but we're also connecting up in the school and community, acting with the community, and then acting lower on behalf for system advocacy. Now you'll notice in this article, it didn't talk about, in the review of this article, we didn't talk about public information or socio-political advocacy. We were working within the closed system of the K through 12 to bring together, which is that community collaboration and the systems collaboration, bringing together people who could advocate or who could provide services to a discriminated population and acting on behalf of those students. So let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about another advocacy as action example. They're going to kill me. Resilience in unaccompanied immigrant minors. So this is also from 2018, and it's a very timely journal article. So we have a current and ongoing problem. Unaccompanied and undocumented immigrant minors, what are called WIM, are entering the U.S. illegally and being placed in short and long-term substandard facilities. That's a polite way to say that we're putting kids in big warehouses and keeping them there, because the legal process to determine their status can be very long and very difficult and very sad. Next slide, please. So by definition, these kids are still developing emotionally, intellectually, and physically. Now think about the whole idea of being warehoused like that and how its impact on you as a developing young person in the world. So the authors of this article identified potential, what they called acculturative stress, depression, and anxiety from 4 forces: linguistically and cultural environment. In other words, they're being placed in an environment where their language may not work for them. That culturally they're a fish out of water. That they're discriminated against within their new culture. So if they are placed outside of the detention facility, if they're placed with families or something like that, and I found this very interesting, that if they're within their own culture, that at times they may be discriminated against because of their status, their immigration status, that their own population may not want them around because it puts them at risk. They're discriminated just because there's discrimination just because our current culture has presented itself, at least a side of itself, that doesn't want these people here and have made that perfectly clear. And that overt prejudice within our current political environment. So next slide, please. So a decade of work, this quote I found fascinating, a decade of work responding to the needs of this population has taught us that counseling psychologists have an important role to play in directing and catalyzing the effectiveness of community resources, expertise, and goodwill to address the needs and support of healthy development of these youth. So that basically, what as they go on to say, is that counseling psychologists commit to multicultural issues, human development, and social justice, provides a rich skill set from which to design and implement advocacy and social change strategies to promote human rights and well-being of WIM. So that's advocacy in action. They're defining, we can do this. Next slide, please. So they've defined the problem. WIMs crossing the border with resultant legal and ethical issues, the negative impact on them, and they've defined the experience and the resources available. Next slide, please. So of note here, and we'll go through this here real quick, but I want to note at the bottom, what are some of the advocacy tasks? One of them is research. And that might not sound like a very powerful advocacy task, but if you think about it, we haven't thought about it as a tool, but the profession, when you provide the profession with information that can be useful in shaping how we work with clients, that we can use research to provide to the public knowledge about the needs of a specific population, that we can provide information, research to the political sphere in shaping policy and procedure and legislation for society. Basically, research is an advocacy tool. We may not have ever thought about it that way, but it's our ability to use our knowledge in human growth and development, in assessment and diagnosis, and our humanity to provide information to decision makers that is both valid and reliable. What are the other tasks? Providing appropriate services and shelters, educating lawyers and judges on issues of the WIMs, about their transition to the U.S. or transition back to their home country, to equip these kids with tools to manage cultural challenges, to advocate and advance immigration policy reform. These are important pieces of advocacy and action that we can do as professional counselors, as a group and as individuals. Next slide, please. So as you can see in the advocacy competencies, we're working with clients and students when we work individually with these students to help them become acculturated or to prepare them and to prepare them for what that might look like in their new country if they stay, or we're helping them as they prepare to go back, to provide them with whatever support we can there. But we also act on behalf within the system and within the socio-political realm by advocating to whatever agencies holding them about what's going on there, to talk to the system about the type of environment that they need in, to talk to legislatures about what is necessary to act humanely and not cruelly, and to provide the public with the necessary information that helps us understand the scope of this problem overall. So next slide. So we're going to jump in. We've got about 15 minutes before lunch. We'll cover just a little bit here. And then we'll do lunch in about 15 minutes. A reminder that we'll stop at about noon. We'll take 60 minutes. We'll try and stop exactly at noon and then go to 1. But if we stop at 12:05, I ask that you come back at 1 o'clock. Hopefully 5 minutes is not going to be too much of a imposition. So now we're going to get into that whole area of what are the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. Next slide, please. Well, effective counseling begins with understanding who our clients are within their world. That's called multiculturalism. The other concept, that assumption, is that we consider how the client is situated in that world. And in these competencies, the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies, we can imagine it almost in a dichotomous way as either marginalized or privileged. And then what impact that makes on the client's well-being. So think about wellness. So it begins with understanding the client's world, how they're situated in the world, and how that makes an impact on them. Next slide, please. Well, it's not just about the clients. It's also about you as the counselor. How you develop an understanding of who you are in the world. If you haven't heard it once, I would be surprised. I would think you've heard this several times, that the beginning of good counseling is to be aware of yourself and how you're situated in the world. Are you marginalized or privileged? Again, a dichotomous choice. We're going to talk about the complexity of that in a little bit, and what impact that makes on your well-being, your self-awareness, as well as your self-awareness of your wellness. Next slide, please. As a counselor educator, I'm often asked by beginning counselors in training about different techniques or exercises to use with clients. And one of the easiest and often misunderstood is the empty chair exercise. Now, many counselors in training will deploy this exercise in training sessions as a way to help the client process emotions and other events or experiences with people in their lives. It's been less so in the last couple of years, but for quite a while there, we had lots of, and I think it may just be the way we were teaching theories and teaching techniques. We had a lot of counselors in training, CITs as we generally call them. We had many CITs who would be working in our counseling training clinic, and we record everything and we observe, who would drop into a empty chair technique with a client thinking that this is what they needed. What they often failed to deploy instead is their own caring self and the ability to connect with someone in pain or turmoil. And the first step in that process to connect with another human being is to be aware of yourself and all that you bring into the room, all the different identities, all the different ideas, your concepts of the world. Now, it's just not bringing those into the room. And what Carl Rogers, as we all know, would call being genuine, your genuineness. But managing those identities and those ideas and those concepts within the relationship to offer that non-judgmental environment to the client to experience. So as I've often said to counselors, and counselors in training, the sharpest tool in any counselor toolbox is you. In all your self-aware glory. Because I work with a lot of, obviously I work with a lot of counselors in training who often tell me that, as they're seeing their first client, they're juggling voices in their head, not because they're suffering from any psychosis, but more because they're still trying to master the skills. And so they spend a lot of time thinking through the skills, and they hear the voice of their professor in the back of their head. And what we spend a lot of time working on, of course, is to decrease the volume of that voice and to increase the volume of their own voice as they sit with someone, listening as they are telling, as the client tells you something in the moment, and to be aware of how that impacts you and your multiple identities and values, and how is that coming from a client who is different than you and their values, their worldview. Are they privileged or marginalized? Next slide, please. I can tell it's getting time for a break because my voice is beginning to give out a little bit. So at the core of the model is this idea that multiculturalism and social justice should be at the center of all counseling. So recently on CESNet, for those people who don't know what CESNet is, it's the listserv, the email listserv for counselor educators. There are about 3,000 people on it, 3,000 people on it. There was a discussion about what are the forces of counseling. And we've often thought about the four forces: psychoanalytic, cognitive behavioral, existential, and humanistic. But they were talking about what's the fifth force and possibly the sixth force. And as we worked through this, as you know, and I don't comment often, and there's usually, you know, a set of people who comment quite frequently, sometimes much to everyone's chagrin. That multicultural and social justice seem to rise to the top as that fifth force, and it's obviously it's been that way, I think, for 20 years. And then the sixth force would be technology now and how we use technology. But that multicultural and social justice need to be part of that force within counseling that pushes us to consider our clients and where they're coming from. Next slide, please. Now, what you're seeing here, what popped up on your screen, is the multicultural and social justice praxis. And this is where in a session, I would love to see this on a great big screen so you could all see it. I hope you can see it clearly in this particular setting. That it's broken up into quadrants, and it gives us kind of an idea of where you sit with your client. Now, I wish I could point out, I wish I had a laser pointer or something, but you'll see that if you think about the quadrants, it's not dichotomous. Instead, it's the relationship between your many identities, which will include in these identities, many identities that are marginalized and many identities that are privileged, with your client, whose many identities may be marginalized and whose many identities may be privileged. And being aware of all the different pieces that go into that as we consider who that client is. So we'll be following along on this as we go through our sessions in this afternoon. So the next slide, please. So quite simply, the four quadrants break down to privileged counselor, marginalized client, privileged counselor, privileged client, marginalized counselor, privileged client, marginalized counselor, marginalized client. Now, if you imagine all your different identities and all the different identities of your client, or perhaps the group you're working with, consider where that falls for you and them and how that impacts your relationship. Next slide, please. Let's talk about that for a moment. I want to do something here. I want to make sure I'm getting to that. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to get to. We're complex people. we have lots of different identities, and so too do our clients. We're made up of racial and ethnic and gender orientation and disability and all these different identities that make up the mix of who we are. And those identities all come into the consultation room. And they can be categorized into privileged or marginalized, client or counselor. And they can be, if you really want to bore down, if you really want to drill down into the basis of this, or to the more micro level of this, that each of those identities are on a continuum of privileged and marginalized. Dichotomously, of course, whether you're the client or counselor. Next slide, please. So I did as an exercise, and I'm going to leave this to you for lunch, to do this during lunch, because we're going to break right here. I think. Let me check something. You guys can't see my other screen. Yeah, this would be a really good place to break. This is an exercise for you to do over lunch. I want you to list all the different identities you have and whether they carry a privilege or whether they're marginalized. And be aware of the context and how that plays a big role in that. Because in one context, you could be very privileged, and in another context, you can be very marginalized, because you can hold both statuses at the same time. So I put up, for example, who I am here. I'm a human who's a Caucasian. I'm straight, male, full professor. I just turned 64 on October 3rd. I'm married, have been married for 38 years. I'm financially secure. I'm a Christian. I'm highly educated. I have survived cancer. And I'm a licensed professional counselor. So if you take a look at the first four, let's walk through those real quick. I make no bones about the fact that I'm Caucasian, straight, male, full professor, and the power that holds for me. I am treated differently in places simply because I'm white, straight, and male. I acknowledge that. And we're going to do a case study in a little while that talks specifically about that. I don't say that with pride or shame. I say it as a matter of fact. I think probably one of the best ways to illustrate that is my wife and I, when we first moved to Ypsilanti, went to JCPenney's. And if you don't know anything about the Southeast Michigan area, it is a really diverse area. Down the street in Dearborn, we have one of the largest mosques in the United States, or the largest mosque in the United States. Detroit is, I believe, 75% Black in population. And we go to Detroit frequently. We love to go to plays in Detroit. It's a beautiful city. It's a great renaissance has happened there, and I invite you to come to Detroit and experience that renaissance. But I'm very much aware of my status, because when we walked into JCPenney's, we walked in and a Black couple walked in, and we were all looking at drapes. And I was watching the customer service person looking at us and trying to figure out who to wait on first, because we arrived at the same time. And you could see it in her face as she began to lean towards us, because she was Caucasian, as she began to lean towards us, how she was trying to make that decision as to who to wait on first. Now, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. As a counselor, I tend to read body language and how people react to things. And I could see that there was some decision making going on, trying to figure out how to manage that particular piece. She didn't know who came in first. She's heading to the person who looked most like her. I'm older. That marginalized and preferred or privileged status. If I were to resign my position and go look for a job right now in the counselor education field, it would be tough. As experienced as I am, I know that there would be some subtle discrimination on the fact that as a 64-year-old full professor, that people might begin to wonder, how much longer does he have in the profession? You know, fortunately enough, I don't have to retire at 65 or 66 in, I think, 4 months. But, you know, that's where we're, you know, that would happen. I'm married. I have privileges because I'm married. I also have privileges in the sense that I can be married. And right now, if you think about the political environment, that there are people in our world, LGBTQ population, who are worried that their right to marriage is being threatened. I never have to worry about that right. All I have to worry about is when my wife gets mad at me and whether or not she's going to off me in my sleep. I don't worry about whether or not if something happened to my wife, if I could remarry somebody of the opposite gender. But people who are same gendered, who are LGBTQ, they worry about that. I'm Christian. And I put both marginalized and privileged there because of it depends on the context. I have been discriminated against because I am Christian by people who have broadly painted the Christian church as one monolith, when in actuality, it isn't. It is a coat of many colors. Unfortunately, there are strands of Christianity and ways of Christianity that have been painted over all people of Christian worth. I'm a cancer survivor. I had prostate cancer 15, 16 years ago. If we didn't have the Affordable Care Act, or I didn't have employer provided insurance, my cost of insurance is higher than other people. And finally, the LPC status, both privileged and marginalized. I'm very much aware of where I fall in what I call the pantheon of mental health services, that there is a hierarchy in mental health services: psychiatrists, psychologists, social worker, LPCs, and marriage and family therapists. And the reason why I pointed out that way is how long it took LPCs to gain insurance rights to be impaneled with Blue Cross Blue Shield in the state of Michigan. It only happened about 5 years ago because the medical director of Blue Cross Blue Shield did not believe LPCs were appropriately trained. We are still struggling to get status to bill Medicare, partially because they believe that the cost of doing so would increase the cost of Medicare, when in reality, we would provide value on the dollar. So in all of these particular areas, I want you to consider, as you identify your different identities, are they privileged or marginalized, and what the context of that is, as we go into break and have our lunch. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. I know I did. I was able to sit with my wife, who's actually now in the other room doing a webinar of her own, except she's the recipient of knowledge rather than the giver of knowledge. So I wanted to address, as I began, I wanted to address a comment that was offered about my perceptions of my marginalized and privileged status as a Christian. And I want to say to the person who offered that feedback, thank you very much for doing that and letting me know what your perception of that was. And I want to acknowledge that Christianity has a long history of being both an incredible, oppressive and discriminatory group of people, discriminatory against people who do not share their worldviews or concepts of God, and is being persecuted in other countries throughout the world. There are people in this webinar who have experienced this oppression firsthand, and for that, I am sorry and wish it weren't true. Additionally, I have known personally within counselor education where I was not considered for jobs due to my history as a Christian pastor, because I was painted with the broad brush of public opinion rather than having someone try to get to know me. So my experience may be minor when compared to others, and yet I ask that we each enter the room acknowledging and honoring each other's history and perceptions and see if we can come together and learn from each other. And that's the basis of this whole idea of of privileged and marginalized identities as we enter a room with a client is to be aware that context makes a difference, not just in my perception of myself, but in the client's perception of me and how the client understands what we're doing. I gotta drop a couple things here and get back to my PowerPoint. There we go. So I want to acknowledge that, make sure that I'm able to say that so that we all are aware of it's not just about how I perceive myself, it's also about how my client perceives me or how they experience me. So I appreciate that person's comment, and I take it in the spirit in which it was given. I really do. I take that to heart. So I hope you had a chance, excuse me, to consider your places and how you perceive yourself as a human being with privileged and marginalized status. So let's go to the next slide. And so you think about these statuses and highlight how issues of power and privilege and oppression impact the relationship between counselors and clients, between you and the person sitting across from you. So we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to really try and buzz through a lot of these slides because we've got like 60 slides to go and we've got 2 hours to do it, and we've got a 5-minute break in between. So what I wanted to point out is the fluidity of our identities and the dynamics of power and privilege and its impact on that relationship. So I want to give you an example. I had a supervisor in Greeley, and he was working with a CEO. Now, this man was an experienced school psychologist, really wonderful and gentle soul. And the CEO would show up for sessions after he was done with work in his power suit. And he was often still in the mindset of a CEO who managed others and led the business. And he saw that counselor as another employee. Now, the counselor for the first few sessions showed up in a shirt and tie as a way to project his own professionalism. And yet, as the relationship developed, the counselor would have a conversation with the CEO about the relationship between them and how the CEO understood it. And slowly, they began to both be able to accept each other as different but equal. They had different statuses within the different quadrants that needed to be recognized and acknowledged to help deepen the relationship so both could move forward. Now, I use this story specifically because it highlights how this isn't just about race, color, creed. It also has to do with ideas of how others perceive us and how we perceive others outside of those particular domains, and how pieces of power and privilege might pay attention in there. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So for an example, here's a really good example. A gay male counselor of color and a heterosexual female client of color may experience their interaction through various lenses. So what are those? They both may perceive their interaction to stem from quadrant 4 because they share racial identities, a common experience to respect the issues of racism. Next slide. Now, alternatively, the client may consider their interaction of form from quadrant 1 with a perspective of gender differences. The client may feel displaced and at a disadvantage because of the counselor's male privilege. Next slide. So again, the other possibility is that the counselor may identify in quadrant 3 because of the difference in sexual orientation. In such a scenario, the counselor may be placed at a disadvantage because of the client's heterosexual privileges. Well, that's true. We live in that world where you do have those heterosexual privileges. So as we see, excuse me, that these domains are and our statuses within them are complex and recognize the many different ways we are in the world and the many different ways we identify ourselves. And they're developmental in nature. And these progressive levels of multicultural and social justice competence are held within these domains. And those domains are counselor self-awareness, client worldview, counseling relationship, and the counselor and counseling and advocacy interventions. So if we go to the next slide, you'd think that my throat would have not dried out. So this all begins, as we talked about earlier, with our own self-awareness of our cultural values, beliefs, and biases. What do you bring into the room that helps or interferes with the growth of the client? Decades ago, we always heard about Freudian psychoanalysis, that the analyst would merely be a blank sheet for the client to project on, and that blank sheet didn't hold any values, didn't hold any identity, that merely was there so that projection could take place and the analyst could provide analysis and explanation. But what we do know now is that we all walk into the room with lots of different values and beliefs and biases, and to learn to manage those so that when we do go in with a client, we're very self-aware of who we are and how that impacts both ourselves and our clients. Next slide, please. But on top of that, it's finding out what the cultural values and beliefs and biases are of the client. So you're self-aware of your own. You need to understand what the client's worldview and their identity development, both just as a person, but also their racial identity development, possibly their sexual racial identity or sexual identity development, all of these particular pieces. So the counseling's no more just our sitting there, but being in the room with somebody in the moment, aware of all the different pieces of ourselves as we move forward. And that's just getting to be more and more complex. So go on, please. So think about this: awareness of how much you may or may not share. Do you share with the client identity? Do you share with them certain privileged and marginalized statuses? Do you share values, or are those values different? Do you share beliefs and biases? And if so, how? And how does that influence what's going on? What's the cultural influence? And how does that cultural influence impact somebody? And in determining that, you begin to determine the direction of treatment. Slide. So this quote has something for us to think about. Scientific research and theory on many topics can be of use, but the practitioner, to really understand, must know and feel the loss and suffering, either directly or vicariously on an emotional level. I was working with a client yesterday via, the internet, and he was telling me about an experience within his education. He was studying to work in the human services field, and what a traumatic experience his internship was. And how when he met with a supervisor from the college, that he was talking about how overwhelmed and how he felt like he was drowning. And how that supervisor said, well, maybe you're not cut out to be in this profession if you can't handle this. And when I heard that, it triggered something in me of how hard that was to hear, but how hard the statement felt, that there didn't seem to be any compassion in it. And I felt in my own stomach the butterflies of somebody who has struggled to hear words like that from somebody else. That's something you've wanted to do for a great part of your life. At this moment in time, someone's throwing doubt on it in a way that didn't feel that there was any empathy or compassion added to it. And it was in that moment that I felt truly connected to my client. Slide, please.
Perry, we actually have a comment in the Q&A.
Sure.
Someone said, depending on who I am with and where I am actually located at that time, my privilege and marginalized status shifts and can work for or against me. How do I balance this in a healthy way with clients who walk into the session with their bias for or against my status?
That's a very good question, because you could walk in from a privileged status and sit down in a marginalized status based on somebody else's perception of you. I think I understand that question. And for me, in that particular moment, personally, I worked through in my head, how is that going to impact our relationship? And do I need to bring this up in order to help this relationship move forward in a way that is therapeutic for the client and helps me be a better counselor? So sometimes, as I put it to counselors in training, it can be both diagnostic in that if this is how this person treats me, I'm wondering how he or she treats other people in the world and what impact that has on the client. Do they need to feel in that privileged seat that they are, that the other person is marginalized or their values or beliefs are opposite of my own, and in fact, those values and beliefs of my client, I don't want to say degrade, but in some cases they can be very degrading of somebody. And if I can go in peace to that person and process that with them, then perhaps that'll help the therapeutic relationship build in a way that I approach it from a non-judgmental, non-defensive position, acknowledging that's impact on me. And at the same time, not saying to the client, you're wrong, you're a fool, you're a bigot, but understanding what helped them develop into that person and how they use it in the world. I hope that answers that. Given who I am, I have not had that experience often, but I know others have had it, and it can be very deeply disturbing, and it can throw you off. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit different way as we get through a little farther into the slides. But I appreciate that question. I do hope I answered that. If not, please put something up in the chat. So the other piece of the domains is counseling and advocacy interventions. So that's embedded in this framework and a call for interventions and strategies at all levels for clients. So for example, in the interpersonal or intrapersonal, if I can also do some advocacy for in institutional and community areas or public policy in international or global areas. This allows counselors to see client issues more contextually and then tailor those interventions to the needs at the individual or system-wide status. So I want to give an example of something that addresses slightly what that participant made as a comment in the question. If someone, and this may seem obvious, but I need to state it, if someone is coming in and feels marginalized and we were talking about this current political situation, due to the current political situation, and what I'm talking about is not the, say, LGBTQ client who feels threatened because the current political climate may strip them of rights that have been hard won. But say somebody who's coming in with a share of white privilege and feels tremendous animus for other people who declare that there is systemic racism and inherent racism, and they're just, think that that's just wrong, and is looking for someone to advocate for them and advocate for their point of view. That'd be a tough one, because I couldn't do it. And how I conceive of that in my own head is looking at it from the point of view of what is the benefit of the greater good. So, as one of the values of counseling, we're seeking to move towards honoring diversity and all people as being worthy of our respect and care. Helping somebody to advocate for a position that goes against the values of counseling in that sense, advocate in a system-wide or agency-wide perspective, to me, would be counter to what would be the best for the population at large. Now, here goes that geeky Star Trek reference. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So, in other words, if what somebody is seeking advocacy for is not beneficial to society, as I understand it, and as the profession let me put it a different way, as the profession understands it, and we move towards those values, then I would want to work with the client on helping them become aware of the impact of who they are and how the world is impacting them and how they're impacting the world. I hope that's clear. So next slide, please.
We have another comment question. How do we best challenge CIT students who do not believe in white privilege?
Yeah, if you got an answer to that, I'd be willing to hear it. I think one of the things that I oftentimes want to go to is I'm reminded the more I push on somebody's defenses, that the more the resistance rises. So instead, I want to think about immersive events, immersive experiences that will help somebody understand what another population is feeling and how their privilege is perceived by others. So, for example, if someone doesn't understand white privilege, would be to take them on an immersive experience into a Black community, to a Black community center, and have them interact and find out what goes on in a population who has experienced systemic racism for decades, if not centuries. Now, I can also imagine somebody who might be white who comes from a poverty situation who would oftentimes say, well, I've never had any privilege. I haven't gotten anything handed to me. I've always been in poverty and worked hard to scrabble for everything that I've gotten. And to be able to, again, help them in a understand how this is from somebody else's shoes who isn't white, but not to diminish what they've experienced. In diminishing what they've experienced is to just have them raise the walls even higher and make them even thicker. That it is to acknowledge that their economic position in the world may be or is a very difficult one. And and their racial position is a different position, that it's not a one size fits all. It's not a one privileged or marginalized for just one identity, that there are several identities that come into the room. I hope that helps and works. Next slide, please. I keep forgetting I put those little things in there. So as we look at the competencies and think about the advocacy within this, we think about acting on behalf and acting with, acting at the micro level and acting at the macro level. So for a counselor in training, how might I act with them, empowering them, at the same time educating them in the community arena and providing them with public information to help them grow, but also advocate for them and perhaps their position economically. So this becomes a crossroads of very different identities throughout a person's life, and how each identity is perceived in the world, not just a singular, but how different identities make up who we are. Next slide, please. So as we think about this, we want to think about what is culture. And dadgummit, isn't it nice that the Code of Ethics provides us with some definitions. So it's a membership in a socially constructed way of living, which incorporates collective values, beliefs, norms, and boundaries, and lifestyles that are co-created with others who share similar worldviews comprising biological, psychosocial, historical, psychological, and other factors. Wow, whew. That's a lot to process. So here we have, as we can see, a lot of different things that make up what culture is. Well, if that's what culture is, what's diversity? It's the similarities and differences that occur within and across cultures. So one of the things that I was always was impressed upon me when I was a doctoral student and as a young or a beginning professor was that there's often more within group differences than there are between group differences. Well, statistically, we can work through that, but we also need to take a look at within a culture, that sometimes within a culture, there's a lot of differences between within a culture, and the experiences of somebody within a culture also feeling oppression and freedom. So remembering to keep that in mind, as well as how that is lived out in somebody's life. Next slide. So quickly, how does culture impact our Code of Ethics? Well, of course, thinking about receiving gifts, non-discrimination, cultural sensitivity and diagnosis and assessment. As we all know that we want to be very cautious in how we, if we're required to diagnose somebody, to use the most accurate and least restrictive. And of course, in our training programs and in our missions to our programs as for counselor educators. So next slide. So here we have the idea of where does all this fit in the in the Code of Ethics. Well, as you can see in the introduction, that we actively attempt to understand the diverse cultural backgrounds of the clients we serve. But we also explore our own cultural identities and how these affect our values and beliefs about the counseling process. So this is where oftentimes, and this is the struggle for beginning counselors, is they often read ethics in a black and white fashion. It's either right or it's wrong. When in actuality, and remember this is from the intro, so this is an aspirational, this is very aspirational, that the idea of good counseling and good ethics is not black and white, that it has lots and lots of shades of gray and requirements for us to develop our sense of self and our self-identity, that we explore who we are so that when we enter the room with a client, that we enter the room in a non-defensive fashion. So let's move to the next slide. And one of the reasons why we want to do this is because if we're aware of our own values, that we are to avoid imposing them, our values, our own values, onto our clients. That we want to respect that diversity. And this statement, this from 2014, was expanded for the 2014 from the previous version from 2005, mainly because we were revising towards really making sure people understood that it was important to understand their values and how those values play out in the session, and especially if their values are inconsistent. That's right, keep going. The values are inconsistent with the client's goals. Remembering that values come from different sources, and remembering that definition, that they're socially constructed, they're collective values oftentimes, their beliefs, their norms, their boundaries, their lifestyles. All of that is part of really sitting with myself and trying to discover what my values are. And this is a lifelong developmental process, because I don't have the same values that I had at 22 when I graduated from college and entered seminary. They're different from the values I had when in 1997 I graduated with my doctorate in counselor education. And they're probably different now that I've been 23 years from that graduation in understanding how my values impact me, how they've developed given my experience in the world. Next slide, please. So that first step of self-awareness talks about what are my embedded cultural values? What are those beliefs? What are those learnings? What are those biases within my community, whether they're privileged or marginalized, and how does that affect the counseling process? So an example would be, excuse me, a disclosure statement. Think about your disclosure statement. Is it an agreement between equals in a supportive community, or is it an agreement between unequals in a community that shuns counseling and mental health issues? It's at the beginning, when we're talking with our clients with our disclosure statement and going through that we begin that whole idea of privileged and marginalized client counselor, counselor self-awareness, client self-awareness, and how that impacts the counseling relationship and my role in doing counseling and advocacy. From the very beginning. Next slide. So I'm going to have you guys go in groups. I would like you to spend 15 minutes. We have a lot left to cover, and it's 1:30, so we've got 90 minutes left before we hit the end of our session, and we still have got a lot to cover. So if you would take your handout, the Word document, and open it up to the case of the adjunct client, read it, and discuss it given what we've talked about already. So I'll turn this over to the moderators to have you placed in groups. So how are we doing? We coming back, folks? I hope so.
Yes, that is pretty much everybody back, Perry.
Excellent. Okay. So I hope you had a, go ahead.
Webcam on, if you don't mind.
I'm sorry?
Your webcam on, if you don't mind.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. There we go. You can all see that wonderful background I bought just for this presentation. So slide, please. So as you're thinking about competencies, think back to your first practicum. What were your skills like? Do you remember how you were breathing, or if you were breathing? You know, the different thoughts running through your mind, hearing the professor's voice in the background, how anxious you were. Are you different today? I hope so, because that's part of what competency is about, is that we develop as professionals probably way beyond how we were when we first got out. So slide, please. And so what we know about competency, it's a combination of knowledge and skills and disposition, and that it's developmental. And this is an important fact. I am more competent today than I was yesterday, than I was the day before, than I was when I first graduated seminary. And the reason why I mentioned seminary is because oftentimes pastors are taught pastoral psychology in a sense of how do you provide pastoral care, which was, you know, I've often been asked, why did you leave the ministry? Because the two things I enjoyed doing the most was teaching and doing counseling. And I found myself doing that a lot, and I always said I'd get a doctorate in something. But when I entered the counselor education program at the University of Northern Colorado, I had, a nice set of skills. But one of the things I learned pretty quickly is those were my skills based on my understanding of what counseling was, and they were different than some of the skills that I needed to be an effective counselor. And so my competence grew and grew and grew to when I graduated, where I was at a basic competence, which is where most people are when they graduate. So let's go ahead and slide forward. So as we begin to talk about these competencies, let's talk about the competencies in the multicultural and social justice competencies. And I'm very much aware of the time. It's 1:53, and I want to give you a heads up. We may go just a little bit long. I promise it won't be 4 o'clock. I want to be very respectful of everybody's time. And in doing so, we may go 5 or 10 minutes over. There are some slides that I'm going to buzz through pretty quickly that are helpful, but are not necessary. So the word aware or awareness in our attitudes and beliefs involves awareness of our social identity, social group status, and so forth. The word aware or awareness appears 21 times in the Code of Ethics. Of those 21 times, 10 are directly related to the ideal that counselors are to develop and maintain a self-awareness about their values, and develop and maintain their knowledge about multiculturalism and diversity, competence and appropriate use of diagnosis and multiculturalism and diversity and supervision, our knowledge of ethics, the power differential and boundaries, and multiculturalism and diversity and training. So counselors who are skilled in the practice of psychotherapy continually work to develop and maintain that sense of self-awareness and their place in this society, and the power they hold or lack of power they hold, and the assumptions they carry about others, and how all of this impacts their ability to provide caring and competent services. Awareness, with awareness, especially about our status, is the understanding of our social identity and social group status and power and privilege. It's our own place in the world, and it comes the necessity to develop a more in-depth understanding of our history and the events that shape our identities in the world. Next slide, please. Additionally, the skills necessary that counselors must also possess the skills necessary to put into action the awareness and knowledge one has gained, including critical thinking, clear, open, non-defensive communication with clients and their communities, the ability to explain how values and status impacts our work, and to analyze and evaluate how statuses and values influence our work with clients, communities, and the public. One simple way to begin the development of these skills is by reviewing how counselors use the informed consent procedure. As we've already talked about, this is not a one-time thing, but as something that is ongoing with our clients. If we change modality, if we change tax in a series of sessions, that we want to inform the client, and do we inform them as equals, as privileged, as marginalized? Where does the power reside? And then we take action to increase our self-awareness. Learning about your assumptions, your worldviews, and culture through professional development opportunities is only one way, and by the way, is a standard in the Code of Ethics that we maintain and continue to maintain our awareness through the use of continued education. But we also want to develop that awareness as status as members of privileged and marginalized groups. As we've already noted, exposure to participation in our community and the community of our clients helps a counselor to learn about how power and privilege influences counselors and clients' experiences in the world. I can remember two very powerful experiences of immersion. In Detroit is the African American Museum, and in Washington, D.C. is the National African American Museum. I have visited both, and this honestly is just a wonderful experience, but at the same time barely scratches the surface of helping me understand how the identity of African Americans, how identity of Black individuals is shaped by their history. And in both cases, to go in and experience the immersive displays and interactive displays in both of these places left me coming out pondering how I can use this information and use this experience to be a better counselor. Again, that's just it in a museum. I would pose it to you, I would say to you that it also includes experiences in the different cultures and different conversations I could have with the many different diverse communities that are all throughout southeastern Detroit or southeastern Michigan. Next slide, please. So one of the assumptions is that we move outside of the consultation room. Consider what the difference, what difference the counselor can make in the greater environment, to move into the world of the client, to moving beyond the individual client and working to improve things for different populations. This is one of the reasons why recently there was, and I'm forgetting, blanking on which one it is, but an executive order written by our current president that ACA took note of and gave a response to. I just want to point that out. I'm blanking on what the subject matter was. If somebody remembers, throw it in the chat and they'll throw it out to me. But we as a profession responding to these different things, I think make a powerful statement. So these ethics, these counseling competencies are built on the ethics. A7, A, and B, that we advocate, next slide, please, that we advocate when appropriate for at the individual, group, and institutional societal level. And we advocate with client consent, that we don't do something on behalf of an individual client to improve the provision of services without their permission. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to skip this case study in favor of making sure that we get through a few more slides, but I really commend it to you. It's a very nice case study. So let's talk about professional values, because we've made a lot of we've talked a lot about values. Let's talk about professional values, because this oftentimes comes up. Next slide, please. Oh, you've got it. All right. So if you figure that the code of ethics is a statement of values, that it's the coat we put on as we enter the consultation room. That's how I describe it to my students. So what does that mean? Well, next slide. I want to be very clear with everybody that the profession does not require you to change your values, your personal values, to be in alignment with the code of ethics. What the profession seeks to have is that you're aware and manage your values so to not impose them on your client in session. Now that's a big difference, because when this whole thing began to crop up, which was about 2009 or so, there was a lot of talk about, my goodness, you're asking me to change my values to be like you. Isn't that antithetical to the code of ethics and just to being genuine? And the point was, no, we're not asking you to change your values to be in concert with what we think the values of the profession are. We're asking you to realize the difference in values and to put on the values of counseling when it comes to the broad range, especially of honoring diversity and social justice. Next slide, please. So this is going to be our reference case for the next 60 minutes or so. I want you to think of, and this is an actual case. This was a case, and I can use it because it was thrown out on the American College Counseling Association listserv many years ago. It was 2011 when it came out, I think, or 2012. And I've always been fascinated by it. So imagine you're the director of a counseling center. One of your practicum students at your counseling center is an observant Orthodox Jew, and he's a very bright and gentle man. And this is exactly how he was described. He announced that he consulted his rabbi and told him that he could see gay people as long as they didn't talk about being gay. The example he gave was if the client is struggling with his or her orientation, that he cannot work with them. The problem is that often if an LGBT client is struggling, it won't arise in the first session, it arises later. And the college has a large LGBTQ population on campus, and this whole thing is, and this was the word that was used, gives you the heebie-jeebies. Next slide. So you're the counseling center director. Here are some questions to consider as we move through these next slides. If he's allowed to not see gay students, are you condoning bigotry? What if the LGBTQ issues arise after, say, 5 sessions? What else might the rabbi forbid? What is the ethical course of action for the practicum student? And I know a lot of the counselor educators are just wishing that that HIAM was not in their program. What is the ethical course of action for you as the director? Next slide. So consider this from the point of view of multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. The case highlights how the issues of power and privilege and oppression impact the relationship between the counselors and the clients. How does HIAM's refusal to see a gay client fit here? Is he a privileged counselor working with a marginalized client because he comes in with the power to be able to say, I'm sorry, I can't work with you. It's against my values and my religion. Is he a marginalized counselor who carries that burden that he sees himself, and I'll explain this a little later on when we talk about moral injury, that he sees himself as somebody who's capable, but his religion holds him back from providing care for somebody who's different than him. Where might this fit? Slide, please. So I take us back to the personal values substandard in A4B, that we respect the diversity of clients, trainees, and research participants and seek training in areas in which they are at risk of imposing their values onto clients, especially when the counselor's values are inconsistent with the client's goals and are discriminatory in nature. This becomes both a competence and a multicultural issue. It holds both those values in there, both those pieces in there. Slide, please. So when you take a look at the word diversity, it appears 31 times in the Code of Ethics. And it's connected to all of these particular issues. And I want to highlight 2 that you can see there in blue. Respecting or honoring somebody, and competence. That we are to respect and honor the diverse nature of our world. And we have to have competence in working with a diverse population. Slide, please.
Harry, we have a question in the box.
Please.
Yep. Someone said, how would you supervise the Orthodox trainee?
We're coming to that. Thank you. I appreciate that. You're just a little bit ahead of me. So if you could just hold on to that question, we'll get there. So what is multicultural diversity competence? How is it carried in the Code of Ethics? That the counselor's cultural and diversity awareness and knowledge about self and others, and how this awareness and knowledge are applied effectively in practice with clients and groups. That's the definition. And then multicultural and diversity counseling, that recognizes diversity and embraces approaches that support the worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of individuals within their historical, cultural, economic, political, and psychosocial contexts. So you see what competence and what counseling is defined as in those two situations. Slide, please. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. This is hopefully I don't get ahead of myself and we end up 5 minutes early. This is a brief history of values in the Code of Ethics. And as I said earlier, we reviewed the Code of Ethics from several English-speaking countries. And there were English-speaking countries because we just didn't have the resources to have codes of ethics from non-English countries translated. Google Translate only goes so far. So here's what we find. Slide, please. So as you take a look at this, you see that the fundamental values of counseling and psychotherapy include respecting human rights and dignity, alleviating personal distress. I'm hitting the blue ones because those are what deal with, that are germane to what we're talking about. Fostering a sense of self that is meaningful to the persons concerned, appreciating the variety of human experience and culture. This is coming out of Britain. Striving for the fair and equitable, adequate provision of counseling and psychotherapy services. If you see things that look like they're misspelled, they're actually not. That's how they spell counseling across the pond. Slide, please. This is Britain's personal moral qualities of a counselor: resilience, respect, competence. Now think about that, the capacity to work with a client's concerns without being personally diminished. I've never thought of resilience that way. Respect, showing appropriate esteem to others and their understanding of themselves. Competence, the effective deployment of the skills and knowledge needed to do what is required. Slide, please. Let's go across the world to New Zealand. Their core values: respect for human dignity, responsible caring, social justice. And the following are the principles, the following principles are the expressions of those core values. And they form, as they say, the foundation for ethical practice. Act with care and respect for individual and cultural differences and the diversity of human experience. Avoid doing harm in all professional work. Now that's going to be something we want to address. Avoid doing harm in all their professional work. Seek to increase the range of choices and opportunities for clients. I like that because that's a good definition of advocacy. And of course, practice within your scope of competence. Let's take a look at Scotland on the next slide. Again, professional values. Work in the best interests and the welfare of their clients and their colleagues. Again, keep that in mind when we talk about what's in the best interest. Members work within their limits of competence. The members respect the dignity, worth, and uniqueness of all individuals. That members recognize and respect diversity and differences between people. That we do not practice, condone, or encourage unjustified discrimination or oppressive behavior. Let's take a look at Ireland. The next slide. So here we are in Ireland. Respect for the rights and dignity of the client. Practitioners are required to treat their clients as persons of intrinsic worth with a right to determine their own priorities, to respect client dignity, and to give due regard to their moral and cultural values. Sounds a lot like autonomy in there. Practitioners are required to monitor and develop their professional skills and ethical awareness on an ongoing basis. So next slide, please. So what you can see in this is a respect for the dignity of your client, these common themes, and to be prepared to work in a diverse world, that we do not discriminate, and to do no harm, to work within your competence, work to maintain and enhance your competence. So addressing all these things at once, what do? We don't want to discriminate. We want to respect our clients, and we want to do no harm. Next slide. So we plainly stated the values, again, that they've been developing throughout the history of the Code of Ethics, that the issue of diversity has always been a part of the Code of Ethics in various forms, and that the 2014 code just simply made them obvious. So let's go to the next slide. And just to look at them again, those number 2 and number 3, honoring diversity and embracing a multicultural approach in support of the worth, dignity, and potential and uniqueness of people in their social and cultural context, and promoting social justice. So let's go to the next slide. So are there competing views on how to handle the issues of values conflicts in the profession? So I'm going to give you a brief overview of Ward v. Wilbanks. If you've never read an overview of it, it's in the Journal of Counseling Development. There's a special section in issue 92, I think it's volume 2, or volume 92, issue number 2. A brief overview of the Ward v. Wilbanks case, because it kind of is a touchstone case. Julia Ward was a counselor in training in our clinic. Before her history in coming into the clinic as part of her training, she had expressed some rather strong and rigid religious views, and we thought we'd address those in her education before she got to the clinic. She was randomly assigned a client who had been previously seen in the clinic and was gay, and wanted to talk about issues of communication with his partner. Julia read the case notes, went to her supervisor, and basically said, "I'll be happy to work with this client as long as we don't have to talk about any issues dealing with homosexuality." That she could not condone or help somebody deal with homosexuality. That raised a huge red flag. She was brought in for an informal review by the faculty supervisor of that particular group of CITs and her advisor. In the formal review, we sought to help her try and understand how she would need to be able to work with a diverse client population, especially because she was going to be a school counselor and she didn't get to choose who she saw. She refused, did not want to participate in an informal remediation plan, and therefore, according to our policies, she was brought up for a formal review. During the formal review, she again immediately demanded to be reinstated to practicum. It became clear during the formal review that she had already sought counsel from legal sources. During the time, she said that she could not condone or support or advocate for anybody who was LGBTQ, and immediately insisted that she wouldn't have to do that as a school counselor, that she would simply just refer any students on who came in with these issues to any other school counselor in her school. We did our best to create a remediation plan that would help address these particular concerns. She refused to participate in the remediation plan, and we removed her from the program. Within 7 days, I think, or 14 days, a lawsuit was filed by the organization called Alliance Defending Freedom. If you look up ADF in the Southern Poverty Law Center, it's known as a radical group of lawyers who push very strong conservative religious values. Just leave it at that. She had been working with this group since the day she entered the counseling program. Lots of legal maneuvers happened for the next 2 years. The first ruling that came down from the federal court was to dismiss the whole case because they found in favor of EMU. On appeal, the appeals court, Sixth Circuit, basically said that the ethics did not specifically state that you had to work with somebody in a values conflict, and that there was enough room for a jury trial to make that determination. Before it got to a jury trial, the university and ADF came to, because they got what they wanted. They got lots and lots of press, and they were able to hold up the appeals court ruling as some sort of victory. They asked for, I think, $750,000 for Julia Ward, and wanted us to stop teaching the Code of Ethics, to change the Code of Ethics, our university, our program, to stop teaching it, to change it, and to reinstate her without any sort of prejudice, and to ensure that she graduated. We refused. One, we can't change the Code of Ethics. Two, we have to teach it because that's a KCREP standard. And three, we were not about to let her back in. They reached a settlement where everything was dropped. Julia Ward was given back her tuition that she'd spent to that point. And she required that a letter be placed in her permanent file that she was never expelled from the university. Well, we didn't expel her from the university. We tossed her from the program. It is amazing if you want to see what the consequences are of a lawsuit like this. What you'll find is read through the comments. This made the New York Times. It made the Detroit Free Press. It made national news. It made local news. And just reading through the comments is absolutely fascinating. It's like a Rorschach on humanity. And I'm a masochist at heart because I read through all the different news stories from both conservative and liberal publications, conservative Christian and liberal Christian organizations, as well as organizations like the ACLU that had this on their page, and read through all the amicus briefs. It's absolutely fascinating to read. So after all of this was done, the new Code of Ethics came out and became very clear as to about this particular issue. When the new Code of Ethics came out, there was lots and lots of commentary on it, which is what you'd expect. And so the Burkholders, along with Dr. Hall, did a study of how counselor educators would respond to the Ward incident as well as the new ethics. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the opinions of Julia Ward were that she was erroneously believing that the referral protected the client, putting her own values ahead. Beliefs that she knows the truth, beliefs that she's responsible for enforcing truth, that Julia was not able to navigate this scenario, and EMU was correct in their approach. On the other side, and these are all counselor educators, the inability to effectively work with students who hold sincere spiritual beliefs, a narrow view of what a counselor is. So in essence, we couldn't do that. That this was religious discrimination, political correctness, that it was a desire, there's a desire for authenticity and genuineness, and to preserve her religious freedom and client rights, and trying to act ethically as she was surely instructed and wanted to avoid doing any harm. Now that last piece, I want to really make sure you remember that, wanted to avoid doing any harm. Next slide, please. So what this gets us to is that there are a confusion of competing codes. That it refers, that we refer when there's a values cultural conflict for the benefit of the client. In other words, non-maleficence, to do no harm. And to work under supervision and work to educate yourself on diversity issues and treatment. So like I've often said before, if you can counsel Adam and Eve, you can do the same for Adam and Steve. Next slide, please. So what are the competing codes here? Well, that counselors practice only within the boundaries of their competence based on their education, training, supervised experience, state and national professional credentials, and appropriate professional experiences. there are a lot of people, professional counselors, who will tell you, I am not competent to treat someone who I have a values conflict with. So, for example, the one that's most prominent today is LGBTQ issues, that I cannot provide that counseling services. One, because I'm not competent, and two, because I'm afraid I might harm them. But the 2014 ethics address this particular issue. Whereas multicultural counseling competency is required across all counseling specialties, counselors gain knowledge, personal awareness, sensitivity, dispositions, and skills pertinent to being a culturally competent counselor in working with a diverse client population. So you can see that multicultural counseling competency is considered a base competency. Next slide, please. There's the non-discrimination code, that we do not condone or engage in discrimination against any prospective or current clients, and then it goes through the whole list. Next slide, please. That we avoid harming our clients or trainees or research participants and try to minimize or to remedy unavoidable or anticipated harm. And that we avoid imposing our values. And in the same breath, we say we respect the diversity of clients and trainees and research participants and seek training in areas in which we are at risk of imposing our values onto clients. Next slide, please. So many mental health professionals have read these codes and taken them to mean refer clients when you cannot tolerate or accept their values or other characteristics, lest you do harm or risk imposing your own values. It's called an iatrogenic harm. If you put that into Google, you'll get this great definition that it refers to the harm caused inadvertently by the process of treatment. And in the same breath, do not discriminate or be influenced by bias, bigotry, or prejudice, but seek to provide caring, competent services to all people, to treat others as you want to be treated. And some people have taken that to be, if I want to not discriminate, then I need to refer the client on to competent care because I'm afraid I would discriminate against the client. If you go back and take a look at the multicultural counseling competencies, is that multicultural counseling competencies is considered a base skill and disposition within counselor education. So think about Chaim, his refusal to see a gay client. How does it fit here again? As we think about everything that we've just covered, how competence is considered a base skill, how we're considering the population that he may be working with and its status in the world, its status at the college, its status within their families and within their culture. Slide, please. So what can this lead to? It's called a discriminatory referral. That occurs when a mental health professional refers a client when they believe that they cannot work with a client's presenting concern, in this case due to a values, religious, lifestyle conflict, before the professional has consulted with the client or sought consultation, supervision, further education, or other means to increase his or her capacity to provide services. So when the professional has not sought these services, they may be referring inappropriately. It's an excellent article written by Shiles. We'll get a little more into that in 2009. So Shiles postulates these particular reasons. Go to the next slide, please. That there is this practice of invisible racism, and it's normative in the mental health field. Now you figure that she wrote this was part of her dissertation in 2009. Think about where we are now 11 years later and what we're talking about structural and implicit and explicit bias. That it maintains our self-interest as moral and decent to refer. In other words, we say it's in the best interest of the client. That referral is certainly easier than obtaining the training and consultation and the introspection necessary. And there's this glorification of referral in the, it should say, in the literature and practice. There's always one typo. Next slide, please. We also know that research has demonstrated that therapist values influence the effectiveness of therapy, that clients and therapist values are often different, and that therapists tend to have more liberal sexual values, and that client values are often influenced or changed by the therapist's values. That when a lot of studies several years ago that talk about how clients often move towards the therapist values. Next slide, please. So what we're having to deal with here, what we're thinking about is, and now this is to answer that question, we begin to talk about how do I supervise this person? That we're called to bracket off our values to the best of our ability. If you suspect that your values are impacting the session of the client, that you should consult with another professional and seek supervision and obtain education. So next slide, please. So again, you're the director, he's the practicum student, he's announced what his rabbi has told him. The example he gave is they're struggling with the orientation, I can't work with it. The problem, of course, is that you've got if somebody's struggling with LGBTQ issues that generally don't arise in the first session, and the college has a large population of LGBTQ students. So next slide, please. So the questions we have to ask ourselves, again, and we've talked about these, what else might the rabbi forbid? What are the rights of the practicum student and so forth? Next slide, please. Well, the rights of the clinician are these, that the clinician is not asked to change beliefs or values. Ethics and good practice require a bracketing off of personal values so to create a therapeutic environment. There's a prohibition against imposing values on the client. Next slide, please. And just go to the next one after that. We've already seen this several times. This is probably the most controversial standard in the Code of Ethics, that we refrain from referring prospective and current clients based solely on the counselor's personally held values, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. That we respect the diversity of clients and seek training in areas in which they are at risk of imposing their values onto clients, especially when the counselor's values are inconsistent with the client's goals or are discriminatory in nature. So you can see the issue here is that not only if you're worried about this, that this is a standard that requires you to make positive action, to seek training, to seek supervision, to seek education and consultation. Again, next slide. So again, we run into this: competence is not an either or concept. The competence is always growing and changing. And there are growing competence requirements, C2A, staying current with the literature and knowledge. Acquiring appropriate skills and doing so through CEUs, supervision, and consultation. Understanding when a referral is necessary due to an inability to gain competence required. So all of a sudden now you see that caveat in there, that is a referral necessary due to my inability to gain the competence required? Now, let me explain that. That doesn't mean that you can't gain it because you're not capable. It means that you can't gain it in a timely fashion to provide appropriate help for the client. This doesn't give you an out because you don't want to do it. It only allows a referral if your service to the client would not be able to happen in a timely fashion. Next slide, please. And again, we come up against C2A and the highlighted area, the blue area, where multicultural counseling competency is required across all counseling specialties. The counselors gain knowledge, personal awareness, sensitivity, disposition, and skills pertinent to being culturally competent. Again, we go back to the multicultural and social justice competencies, to be aware of your limitations and the action to do something about it. Thank you. So the confusion over referring occurs when we don't want to impose our values, and that we've got to be competent. So referral becomes that last resort, that we're required to be proactive, to get the consultation, to do the supervision, to obtain the education. So you've asked, everyone's asked, okay, that's great. So how am I supposed to deal with HIAM? What would I do with HIAM? We're getting there. So next slide, please. So questions to ask before you're making a referral. Based on my training, and this comes from Shiles, based on my training and experience, do I feel competent to work with this client? Not based on my values, but based on my training and experience. Second, can I be respectful of my client's beliefs related to their present concern? So if I can't be respectful, you need to go back and do something about yourself. How might my reaction to this client differ from my reaction to a client with a similar presenting concern, but with different demographic variables? I love this question. And the reason why I really love this question is because it really puts it on the line. If you can counsel Adam and Eve, what's stopping you from counseling Adam and Steve? That means you really need to take a look at what's going on for yourself. Next question, please. Or next slide, there we go. Can I expand my competence regarding this issue through reading, supervision, and other professional activities? I can tell you the answer to that is 99 times out of 100, yes. You only need to go to PESI's website, PESI. I get flyers from them all the time about continuing education. If you go to their website and type in any sort of subject matter, they've got a webinar on it. Are you willing to work at expanding your competence? If not, why? That's a great question, because it really is concerning. If you're not going to expand your competence in this area, especially if it's a base competence expected of all mental health professionals, why are you not doing it? And is this an area that the counseling profession regards as essential? And it is. So when referring this client, would this cause more harm than good? And for other clients with similar characteristics who are considering counseling. And have you exhausted all other options before considering a referral? And that's the important piece. And that's why discriminatory referrals and the glory of referring gets in the way. That in many cases, I just don't have I do not want to make the time or spend the money to do so. So let's go to the next slide real quick. We're going to run through these particular issues real quick. So social justice and advocacy, and yeah, hold on. Do they have a price? Do you pay a price for strongly held beliefs that are contrary to ethical practice? Now you can move on. There's a great article. Yeah, go ahead. One more slide. There you go. Right there. So there's a great article on ethical and moral reasoning called Ethical Diversity and the Role of Conscience in Clinical Medicine. I don't remember how I came across this, but it really, it's a dense read, but it's a really good, thought-provoking article. They're talking about the medical community becoming more ethically diverse, that there are more and more people as the profession becomes more and more diverse, and so more ethical diversity of thought. That they have what are called issues of conscience are increasingly problematic. And emerging technologies and expectations involve more than treating disease and alleviating suffering. So think about that from the point of view of that our technology has gotten past our ability to morally and ethically reason through whether or not we need to use this technology. Next slide, please. The diverse priorities increase the complexity of medical decisions. So we're trying to balance wellness and conserving priorities. And conserving priorities mean conserving short supplies and so forth. But evolving standards, quality of life decisions, and all of these changing harmful patient behavior. I recently had a physical, and it's amazing what the doctor will tell you when you just listen. Pressure to follow external clinical healthcare standards over your own personal wisdom and ethical conviction and peer standards. So these types of things are really beginning to put pressure on the medical communities. Next slide. So the author asks these three questions. When health providers disagree with their patients or colleagues or regulatory professional bodies about the suitability of a specific type of care, which standards should provide a point of reference for the practitioner's ethical course of action? Is it acceptable to punish health providers, and that's professional discipline, loss of privileges, loss of job, etc., because of their commitment to an act in accordance with their firmly held ethical position? What impact does acquiescence to regulatory edicts have on health professionals who hold ethical and moral reservations about existing ethical standards and guidelines? So the next slide has a table that gives an example of how this might play out. So the dilemma, a physician feeling pressured to perform CPR, the situation, a case where in a case situation consistently deemed medically futile, a clinician refuses to prolong dying, squandering resources, and extend a patient's suffering by repeatedly commencing CPR. The third one, physician asks for advice about the suitability of abortion. So the physician is asked about this. The patient seeks advice from a rural physician on suitability and wisdom of having an abortion after discovering that developing fetus has cystic fibrosis. What if you are a physician who does not support abortion? One that is being confronted by our society more and more consistently as our society has more aging population, is a patient's request for assisted suicide. That this elderly patient adamantly requests that the physician prescribe a lethal dose of medicine. Next slide. So is there a cost to being required to provide care that goes against your beliefs? If so, does it create a moral injury? And that refers to the consequences resulting from perpetuating failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs or expectations. Is there a moral injury? Next slide. So where does this come from? This is associated with the military, when soldiers need to act in ways they otherwise would not, that others would not in analogous situations or events of life and death. So there's a story told, and I think everybody probably has heard this in one way or another, that when soldiers during the Iraqi war and the Afghanistan war, that when they were traveling through towns, they were told not to stop for anything, because if they did, they either might come under attack or they might find themselves over an improvised exploding device, an IED. And where that pops up, where that becomes really powerful, is when people would use children and place them out in the street playing with a ball to stop a convoy. And some soldiers were told, drive, just don't stop, it's a trap, drive. And you have to think about what happens if you hurt or damage this child or kill this child. And there were cases in the United States where they found soldiers who had returned from the war who were driving erratically or driving aggressively in traffic. And that was because they were taught to do that in order to save their lives. And to be haunted by that, to have the PTSD, that moral injury that came with that. So an individual's, this is from the article, an individual's moral framework may constitute a fundamental component of their identity, and coercion to engage in behavior that violates their moral code may represent an assault on their moral ecosystem and a violation of personal integrity that threatens their essential humanity. Slide. So here's, we'll just hit one of these dilemmas. Counselor is a gay black man who immigrated to the US from South Africa and has suffered discrimination, is told by his employer to manage the case and his own emotions. The situation, the client sent by employer for discriminatory and potentially violent behavior at work. He attends rallies that have turned violent supporting white rights. Imagine the conflict involved in that. Next slide, please. So what we have found is a repeated moral injury. The research on that currently in the medical field is only on nurses. It's called a stress of conscience, and it leads to burnout in the healthcare professionals. And the research right now is in psychiatric nursing, neonatal, geriatrics, and intensive care. And it's defined as the inability to provide the care necessary, knowing that you could alleviate the suffering. Next slide, please. So among physicians, the preliminary research is anguish in ethical situations in podiatry, general medicine, and critical care. So that's where we're struggling right now in the profession, or where I think we're struggling right now in the profession, is being able to manage our professional values and our personal values in session, and at the same time not cause moral injury to ourselves. I know Barbara Herlihy is working in San Antonio now. She retired out of New Orleans. And I sent her this article, and I know she's working with some doctoral students to do some research in this area. So next slide. So let's apply these questions to the counseling profession. When professional counselors disagree with their patients, colleagues, or professional ethics about the suitability of a specific action to be taken, what standards should provide a point of reference for the counselor's ethical course of action? Is it acceptable to punish counselors because of their commitment to act in accordance with their personally held beliefs? And what impact does that acquiescence to regulatory edicts have on those professionals who hold those strong beliefs? So next slide. Yeah, let's see, what time is it? Okay. So we'll skip this. So how does this play out in the law? So the case in Tennessee, when the new codes came out, it's a very interesting case. It's one of the reasons why ACA pulled out of Memphis to go do their conference back in San Francisco, which I thought was very ironic, was a counselor who was not a member of the ACA complained to his state legislator that the ACA Code of Ethics, which the Tennessee state law endorsed, did not allow him to make referrals and didn't allow him to practice counseling the way he wanted. He had strongly held religious beliefs, and he liked to provide conversion therapy. So they changed the law in Tennessee that you don't have to follow the ACA Code of Ethics on referrals. In Arizona, you may not remove any student from a mental health counseling education program, so psychology, social work, so forth, for sincerely held beliefs. This was a result of the Ward v. Wilbanks case and the Keaton versus Augusta. Next slide, please. Now, the other side of this, the conversion therapy with minors. It's banned in several states and jurisdictions, and it's shown to be harmful, but still practiced by some counselors when requested. Now, I want to make a difference. I want to highlight a difference here. There's a difference between strongly held religious beliefs and practicing with something that is known to cause harm and has scientific evidence behind it, which conversion therapy does. It's shown to not be effective and to cause harm. Now, let's play that out in another way. Do we have any research, none that I'm aware of, but I'm sure it's out there, on making inappropriate referrals and how that impacts the client's image of counseling, whether or not they'll participate in counseling, and how that impacts their issues and how it might be perceived as harm. Next slide, please. So the question persists. If you're forced to act contrary to your sincerely held beliefs, are you marginalized? And how does that impact your work? Do you feel marginalized knowing that you're going into a situation where that person has values or beliefs that are not consistent with yours and in fact are opposite and violent towards, you might perceive as violent towards yours? Next slide, please. So what's that possible solution? Next slide. Yep, there we go. Is a good ethical decision-making model that when you're faced with an ethical dilemma that are difficult to resolve, you're expected to engage in careful decision-making. That's in the Code of Ethics, and like I told you, it is not considered, we don't put a standard model in there because there's lots of them. And so here we go, next slide, with how do I supervise that person? This is based on Michael Cosett and Barbara Herlihy created an ethical decision-making model, a values-based conflict model. Step one is determine the nature of the values conflict. Is it personal or is it professional? Step two is to explore those core issues. If it's personal, recognize your role and recognize potential barriers and how personal values impede the relationship. If it's professional, recognize the countertransference and the deficiencies in skills and training or expertise. Next slide. If it's personal, you got to consult the code, consult colleagues, supervisors, the literature, seek additional training and supervision. You can see where we're moving in this particular way is that we want you to follow the codes and get that training and utilize ethical bracketing theory. So immersion, education, consultation, but bracket off and be aware of bracketing off those values and identify ways to maintain your personal or religious or moral values so that the moral injury will not occur, that you spend time exploring that within yourself. Again, on the professional side, to create, I'll just highlight one, to create a professional remediation plan to increase your skill and to seek additional training and supervision. Next slide. So to seek on the personal side, examine a rationale and basis for potential referral and whether or not a referral to another provider is ethical or unethical. And assess the effectiveness of a remediation plan for yourself. On the professional side, examine whether or not the intended referral to another professional, again, is ethical or unethical. To explore your rationale on the basis for that referral and to assess effective remediation plan. Final step in this process, to ensure the proposed actions promote client welfare. Let me bring us all the way back to the beginning of our presentation. What's the purpose of our Code of Ethics? Is to provide appropriate care for our clients and to respect our clients and provide a non-judgmental environment. Next slide, please. So one last thought on this section. This is not about religious views or counseling practice. 50 or 60 years ago, this was about race. 20 years ago, it was about gender. Now, it's about sexuality. This is about the ability to manage one's values, whatever they might be, when working with a client with a different set of values. In 20 years, there's going to be some other issue that's going to pop up, whether or not we can provide counseling to androids, for all I know. Next slide, please. So I have no simple answer to what to do about Chaim. I think Chaim's a very nice and wonderful man. I think my best bet would be to work through this step-by-step process with him. And then I have to go to the code. And probably the hardest decision I'll have to make here is whether or not I have to practice the ethical mandate to gatekeep. Can this counselor work with a population that's different from him? Does he have disposition and skills? I say he does. I also say he needs to learn how to manage his own values in those particular situations. Next slide. If so, is there the potential for a moral injury? Is he both privileged and marginalized? And what about his clients? We've already talked a little bit about how we would supervise him. Next slide, please. So, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or perish together as fools. I thank you for your time and attention. We're at the end of our presentation. I will stick around for questions if you wish, and I thank you for allowing me to be with you today.